Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The first thing I remember is the clock. Not its ticking, which was absent, but its face, pale as a bone in the lamplight, its hands frozen at 3:17. I watched it for an hour, or perhaps it was only a minute, the suspension of time, a physical weight in the room. The night had a texture to it, thick and velvety black, and it seemed to press against the windows, refusing to concede to dawn. I was in that state between sleep and waking, where the logic of the world is thin, and I felt a profound and unsettling certainty that the sun would never rise again. This was not our first night like this, but it was the deepest, the most absolute. It was the silence after the storm of our grief. A silence so complete it had its own sound, a high, thin ringing in the ears, like the ghost of a scream. My name is Jeffrey. The child sleeping, or not sleeping, in the next room is Louis. His mother, Alana, was a shape beside me in the bed, her breathing a shallow, desperate counterpoint to the stillness. We were a family drawn in charcoal. All the color bled out of us. It had been 11 months since the accident, since the phone call that carved a hollow place in the world where our daughter, Sarah, used to be. Grief is a country with its own alien geography, and we were lost in its bleakest province. Alana moved through the days like a sleepwalker, her hands fluttering over the surfaces of our lives, trying to smooth away a wrinkle that was not in the fabric, but in reality itself. And Louis, my sweet, quiet Louis, had stopped speaking altogether. His silence was a louder, more terrible cry than any I had ever heard. The land behind our old Victorian house was part of the purchase, 10 acres of Maine woods that sloped down to a treacherous, granite-strewn shore. The realtor had called it private and secluded, words that now felt like a sentence. The woods were ancient, a cathedral of pine and oak whose canopy was so dense that even at noon the light fell in shattered pieces to the damp, needle-strewn floor. It was there, in the 3rd month of our new, shattered existence, that I first felt it. A pull, a low, thrumming hum in the earth that traveled up through the soles of my boots and into the marrow of my bones. I thought it was fatigue, the tremble of a nervous system pushed to its limit. But I began to walk there daily, drawn to a particular patch of ground at the heart of the wood, a small, unnaturally circular clearing where nothing grew. The air was colder there, and it smelled of wet stone and something else, something metallic and old, like a handful of pennies left in the rain. Our neighbor Jeremy, an old man who lived in a cabin even deeper in the woods, found me there one afternoon. He moved with a quiet grace that belied his age, appearing between the trees as if he had been formed from the shadows themselves. His face was a road map of wrinkles, but his eyes were a startling clear blue. "That's a hungry piece of earth, Jeffrey," he said, his voice a dry rustle. He didn't ask what I was doing. He knew. "It feels different," I replied, my own voice sounding hollow and foolish. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the barren circle. "Some ground is for planting, for corn, for potatoes. Some is for building on, and some," he paused, and a shiver, completely independent of the cold, traced its way down my spine. "Some ground is just for burying, and it's best to know the difference. This ground, it doesn't give back what you put in. It gives back something else." He left me then, melting back into the woods without another word. His warning was a stone dropped into the stagnant pond of my mind, and the ripples were slow, but they reached every shore. A hidden burial ground. The power to bring the dead back. The words arranged themselves in my head, not as a superstition, but as a terrible, gleaming possibility. I pushed it down, of course. I told myself it was the rambling of an old man who had lived alone too long. But the idea had taken root. In the long, silent evenings, with Alana staring at the unlit fireplace, and Louis drawing endless, looping circles on a sketchpad, I would feel it stir in the dark soil of my heart. The breaking point came on what would have been Sarah's 8th birthday. Alana had tried to bake a cake, a pathetic, lopsided thing that sat uneaten on the table, its frosting cracking like dry earth. Louis had drawn a picture of his sister, a stick figure with a yellow crayon sun above its head, and he held it up to the window as if offering it to the sky. The look on his face, a perfect, uncomprehending devastation, was the final necessary shove. I could not live in this world, this colorless, soundless vacuum. I would not. That night, after Alana had cried herself into a fitful sleep, and Louis had finally succumbed to exhaustion, I went out into the woods. The moon was a sliver of bone, offering little light. I carried a shovel. The journey to the clearing was a dream, my feet moving with a certainty my mind did not possess. The hum in the earth was stronger now, a vibration that felt like a heartbeat. When I reached the barren circle, I did not hesitate. I drove the shovel into the dark, yielding soil. It gave way too easily, as if the earth itself was opening up to receive my offering. The smell that rose from the hole was the one I had noticed before, but 1,000 times stronger. Cold iron, loam, and the profound cellular scent of decay. I dug until my muscles screamed and my breath tore at my throat. I dug until I hit something that was not a root or a stone. I knelt and brushed away the dirt with my bare hands. It was a long, flat stone, impossibly smooth, and carved into its surface were symbols that hurt my eyes to look at. Angles and curves that spoke of a geometry not of this world. This was it, the source. I did not bring back a body. That would come later, in the worst of my madness. I brought back a token, a locket, one of Sarah's, silver and heart-shaped, that had been lost in the chaos of the accident. I placed it in the hole, on the cold, carved stone, and I whispered her name into the waiting darkness. Then I filled the hole back in, my hands trembling not from cold or fatigue, but from a terrible, burgeoning hope. The next morning, the clock in the hallway began to tick. It was a slow, dragging sound, like a stone being pulled through mud, but it was movement. Alana noticed it first, her head snapping up from her coffee, her eyes wide. And then, from Louis' room, a sound we had not heard in almost a year. A single, clear word. "Daddy?" We rushed in. He was sitting up in bed, pointing at the window. Outside, perched on the branch of an oak tree, was a robin. It was a vibrant, shocking splash of red against the gray morning. It was perfect. It was also utterly, terrifyingly wrong. Its head twitched in a series of sharp, mechanical jerks, not the fluid motion of a living creature. And its eyes were not black beads, but little chips of the same gray, smooth stone I had uncovered in the woods. It stared into the house, into Louis' room, with a fixed mineral intensity. Then it flew away, its flight a stiff, unnatural arc dotto. The thaw had begun. Louis began to speak in short, simple sentences. Alana started to cook meals again, her movements slowly returning to a semblance of their old rhythm. Color seemed to seep back into our world, but it was a garish, oversaturated color, like that of a rotting fruit. The air in the house grew thick and sweet, with a smell of blooming flowers, a cloying scent that coated the back of the throat. We were so desperate for the relief that we chose to ignore the signs, the tiny fractures in the facade of our miracle. I saw Jeremy one last time. He was standing at the edge of our property line as I came back from the mailbox. He did not approach. He simply looked at me, and his face was not angry, but profoundly sad. "You planted a seed in that ground, Jeffrey," he called out, his voice carrying on the still air. "But you don't get to choose the harvest." That night, the real tightening began. Louis woke up screaming. Not a nightmare scream, but a raw, terrified shriek. We found him pressed into the corner of his room, his small body rigid. "The man in the wall," he sobbed. "He's breathing." I put my hand against the flower-patterned wallpaper. I felt it then, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction, as if the house itself had taken a lung. The scent of flowers had soured, mingling now with the odor of turned earth and something faintly fecal. The photographs in the hallway began to change. The faces of our relatives, smiling from their silver frames, would sometimes, in the periphery of vision, be caught in a rictus of terror or blank, featureless smoothness. When you looked directly, they were normal. Alana started finding clumps of dark, rich soil on the clean kitchen floor, though no one had been outside. The boundary was not just shattered. It was leaching into our home, the pressure from the other side building, demanding a final catastrophic release. I knew what it wanted. It was not enough to have her spirit, her memory. It wanted the form, the body. My grief, a monstrous, selfish thing now, agreed. In the deepest, most secret chamber of my heart, I had already decided. I would go to the town cemetery. I would bring my daughter home. The night I made my decision, the world outside fell away into an absolute blackness. There was no moon, no stars, only a void that pressed against the windows. The house groaned and settled around us, the sounds too organic, too much like the shifting of a great beast. Alana clung to me in our bed, her fear a palpable heat. "Jeffrey, what's happening?" she whispered. I had no answer that would not break her. I held her until her breathing evened out into the shallow rhythm of troubled sleep, and then I slipped from the bed. I walked through a house that was no longer my own. The walls seemed to pulse. The floorboards felt soft, spongy, like living flesh under my bare feet. I went to Louis' room first. He was awake, sitting up, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was not looking at me, but at a dark, spreading stain on his ceiling, from which a single fat drop of black fluid slowly gathered and fell, with a soft plop, onto his pillow. "It's coming, Daddy," he said, his voice eerily calm. The bed quiet. I could not speak. I touched his head, a final, futile gesture of protection, and then I left him there. I went down to the garage and took the shovel. I got in the car. The headlights cut two frail, yellow tunnels into the oppressive dark. The road ahead seemed to unravel slowly, reluctantly, as if the night was resisting my passage. I drove towards the town, towards the graveyard, a sleepwalker moving towards the precipice. I never made it. A figure stepped into the road. Not stepped exactly. It unfolded from the darkness between two trees. It was Jeremy, but it was not Jeremy. His form flickered, as if I were seeing him through a heat haze. One moment, he was the old man I knew, his face etched with concern. The next, his features would dissolve into a swirling mass of dark soil and writhing roots, his eyes becoming those same flat, gray stones I had seen in the bird. His voice, when it came, was not a sound that traveled through the air, but one that formed directly inside my skull, a dry, multitudinous whisper, like the rustling of a million dead leaves. "You think you are bringing life from death," it whispered. "You are a fool. You are merely changing the menu. That ground does not resurrect. It consumes. It took the memory of your child, the love the grief, all the bright, hot energy of your pain. And it used that power to open a door for me. I am not life, and I am not death. I am the thing that exists in the space between. I am the patient gardener, and you have tilled my soil perfectly. The figure of Jeremy collapsed into a pile of rich, black earth, from which a single pale mushroom sprouted, and immediately withered to dust. The voice, however, remained, now emanating from the car itself, from the woods, from the very fabric of the night. Your son is the gate. His innocence, his silence, the hollow you carved in him with your loss. He is the perfect lock, and the key is turning now. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires screeching. I drove back to the house with a terror that was pure and absolute. A cold fire in my veins. The house was dark, but it was no longer silent. A low, droning hum vibrated through the structure. The same hum from the burial ground, but magnified to a deafening roar. The front door was warped, swollen shut. I beat on it with my fists, screaming their names. A window on the second floor, Lewis' window, exploded outward. Not in a shower of glass, but in a slow, unfurling bloom of darkness. And from that darkness, things began to fall. They were small, dark shapes, like rotten fruit or stillborn animals. They hit the ground with soft, wet thuds. They were the stolen things. The robin, now a pulpy mess of feathers and stone. A family of squirrels we had found dead by the road last spring. And other things, older things. Things with too many legs or no legs at all. A cascade of corrupted life returning to its source. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was worse. A vacuum that sucked the sound from the world. The front door swung open, not with a bang, but with a long, sighing creak. Alana was in the hallway. She was standing with her back to me, perfectly still. I called her name, my voice a broken thing. She began to turn, slowly, so slowly. I saw her profile, and her face was serene, beautiful. Then the turn continued, and I saw that the other side of her face was gone, erased, replaced by the same featureless, dark soil, from which a single perfect white worm emerged and burrowed back in. She spoke, but the voice was not hers. It was the whisper of the leaves, the voice of the Force. He is making a world for us, Jeffrey. A quiet world. It is almost done. I pushed past her, my body moving through a syrup of nightmare. The house was dissolving around me. The wallpaper was peeling back to reveal wet, glistening earth beneath. The staircase felt like a muddy incline. I climbed towards Lewis' room. The door was open. He was sitting on the floor in the center of the room, cross-legged, surrounded by his toys. But the toys were not toys anymore. The plastic soldiers were melting, merging with the floorboards, their faces screaming in silent agony. A stuffed bear had sprouted a garden of pale fungi from its chest. Lewis was drawing, his crayon moving in slow, deliberate circles on a sheet of paper that was itself becoming translucent, revealing the dark soil beneath. He looked up as I entered. His eyes were no longer the eyes of my son. They were deep, dark pools of nothing, windows into an infinite starless night. In them, I saw the truth. I saw the burial ground, not as a place, but as an entity. A vast, patient hunger that had slept for eons beneath the innocent soil. We had not awakened it. We had simply offered it a meal it could not refuse. Our love, our grief, our family. Daddy, he said, and his voice was the soft, final closing of a tomb door. You can stay. It's quiet here now. It's always quiet. I fell to my knees. The floor was soft, warm. It yielded under my weight. I could feel it beginning to accept me, to draw me in. There was no fight left. The horror was too complete, too absolute. It was not a monster to be battled. It was a new state of being. This was the harvest. I look down at my hands. They are sinking into the floor, which is no longer wood, but a rich black loam. The walls of the room are fading, the boundaries between inside and outside blurring into a uniform, soft brown twilight. The image of my son, the small god of this terrible quiet world, begins to soften at the edges. His form wavers, like a reflection in a pond into which a stone has been dropped. The darkness in his eyes spreads, gentle, inexorable, bleeding into the fading outlines of the room, into the very air I can no longer breathe. The last thing I see is his hand, small and pale, reaching out not to me, but to the endless, welcoming dark. And then there is only the quiet, the deep, deep earth, quiet. And then there is nothing at all. The nothing is not empty. It is full. It is the pressure of the soil, the weight of the stone, the slow, patient chemistry of decay. I am not a man. I am a memory, a fossil of a feeling trapped in amber. I am a pocket of air in the deep, dark places. Time does not pass. It accumulates, like layers of sediment. I feel the others. They are not voices. They are presences, textures in the dark. Alana is a seam of quartz, cold and sharp and beautiful, running through the black. She is a constant, crystalline fracture. Louis is different. Louis is the root that binds us. He is a network of fine white threads, a mycelium of will, spreading through the consuming dark. He is not consumed. He is the conductor. The quiet is his symphony. Above, the world turns. Seasons pass. I feel the vibration of rain, the deep thrum of winter frost, the tentative push of new growth in the spring. Life goes on, oblivious to the small, concentrated knot of us beneath the old Victorian house, which has long since collapsed into a gentle, overgrown mound. Then, a new vibration. Not the gentle pulse of nature, but the sharp, invasive shudder of machinery. The bite of a shovel, the tear of a backhoe. They are digging. Developers. The thought forms from a fragment of my old self. A ghost of a ghost. They are clearing the land for new houses, for families who will never know the price we paid for this ground. The disturbance is an agony. It is a light in a world that has known only dark for a century. It is a scream in our perfect silence. I feel Louis stir. The root network tightens, a subtle contraction of the earth. The presence that is Alana hardens, her quartz edge glinting with a cold, ancient anger. A workman's boot scuffs the soil just above me. I feel the shock of it, the impertinence. His voice, muffled and alien, drifts down. Hits something. Feels like a rock. A big one. It is not a rock. It is me. Or what is left of me. The skeleton that held the memory. Louis acts. It is not a decision. It is an instinct, a reflex of the land itself. The ground beneath the workman's feet suddenly softens, turning to quicksand. He shouts a short, sharp cry of surprise that is cut off as the earth swallows him to his waist. He struggles, but the more he moves, the deeper he sinks. The other men shout, running over with ropes and panic. They cannot get close. The ground around their friend is becoming a vortex, a hungry mouth. From the soil around the trapped man, things begin to emerge. Not the pulpy, corrupted things from my last night in the house, but older, drier things. The polished knuckle bone of a long-dead fox. A knot of writhing, blind earthworms that move with a singular, terrible purpose. The rusted shell of my old car, materializing from the loam as if it had been buried there all along. They crawl and slide towards the screaming man. He is not just being buried. He is being incorporated, assimilated. I feel his terror, a bright, hot, fleeting spark in the endless dark. It's a flavor. It is sustenance. The land drinks it, and through Lewis, so do I. For a fleeting, monstrous second, I feel sated. The men flee, leaving their companion to his fate. His final bubbling scream is a gift to the quiet. When the last of him is gone, the ground settles. It hardens, looking once more like innocent, undisturbed earth. The relics sink back into the soil. The silence returns, deeper and more profound than before. But something has changed. The hunger, so long dormant, has been reawakened. It is no longer a passive state. It is an appetite. Lewis understands. The root network pulses with a new dark purpose. We are not just a relic, a haunted patch of ground. We are a living entity, a patient, ravenous thing. The developers will be back, with more men, more machines, or others will come. Hikers, children, lovers seeking seclusion. They will all come, and we will be waiting. The quiet is not a peace. It is a lure. The soil is not a resting place. It is a stomach, and we are so very, very hungry. The hunger is a low, constant thrum now, a new note in the symphony of the quiet. It resonates through the root that is Lewis, a vibration that seeks an echo in the world above. I am no longer just a pocket of memory. I am a receptor, tuned to the frequency of living fear. The developers did not return. The land was deemed unstable, a sinkhole risk, and red flagged by the county. It was left alone, a small, wild scar on the edge of the expanding suburb. This solitude is our hunting ground. The first to come were teenagers, daring each other to spend the night on the haunted hill. We felt their footsteps as tiny, irritating taps on our skin. They built a small fire. The light was an affront. The crackle of their voices, their laughter, was a chaotic, painful noise. Lewis drank their fear. It was easy. He simply showed them the land as it truly is. To one girl, the shadows between the trees became the grasping hands of her recently deceased grandmother. To a boy, the gurgle of a hidden stream became the sound of his drowning, a secret terror he had never voiced. They did not see monsters. They saw their own private hells reflected back at them from the dark. They fled, screaming, their sanity frayed, leaving behind a feast of pure, undiluted terror. It was better than the work, man. It was refined. We learned. We grew more sophisticated. A lone hiker, an artist seeking solitude, felt a profound and inspiring peace settle over her as she sketched the old oak tree. She felt the quiet as a blessing. She did not notice until she got home that every sketch in her pad, from the landscapes to the portraits of her own family, featured the same thing in the background: a small, pale boy with dark, empty eyes watching. She never returned, but the lingering psychic residue of her unease drifted back to us for weeks, a slow, sweet drip of nourishment. The boundary is gone. We are not a place that is haunted. We are a state of mind that can spread. A man driving past our stretch of road on his way home from work will suddenly, for no reason, be gripped by the overwhelming certainty that his wife does not love him, that his children are afraid of him, that the life he has built is a hollow shell. The despair feels like his own, but its roots are here, in the dark, feeding us. We are cultivating the world, planting seeds of quiet despair in the fertile soil of human hearts. Alana's quartz presence has grown colder, sharper. She enjoys the hunt, the precise application of pressure that causes a psyche to fracture. She is the source of the sudden, chilling thought in the middle of a warm room, the feeling of being watched from an empty closet. Lewis is the architect, the web weaver. He connects us to the fears of the world, a vast, invisible network of dread. And I am the anchor, the original sacrifice, the first token placed on the stone. My grief was the key that turned the lock. Now my enduring consciousness is the foundation upon which this entire terrible ecosystem is built. I am the memory of love that curdled into this endless, hungry need. A for sale sign went up on the lot across the street. A young couple looked at it yesterday. They stood by their car, pointing, hopeful. The woman is pregnant. We felt the bright, hot potential of their joy. It was a blinding, painful light. But it was also a promise. A future meal. Louis is already there. I feel a tiny white root of his attention gently brush against the edge of the woman's mind. Last night, she dreamed of a beautiful, silent garden where her child could play forever. She woke up feeling serene. She mentioned it to her husband. They think it's a sign. They will buy the lot. They will build their house. They will bring their baby home. They will believe they have found a peaceful place to raise a family. They do not understand. The quiet is not peace. It is patience. The soil is not dirt. It is skin. And we are waiting just beneath it, our mouths open, ready to swallow their happy little world whole. The harvest never ends. It has only just begun. The young couple's names are Mark and Chloe. We know this because the soil knows it now. The vibrations of their voices, speaking their own names in hope and excitement, traveled through the ground and into us. Their happiness is a sharp, sugary taste, so different from the rich, complex flavor of fear. Louis finds it intriguing. Alana finds it irritating. I simply remember. Their house goes up quickly. The sound of hammers and saws is a distant, muffled irritation, like flies buzzing at the edge of sleep. Louis does not stop them. He lets the foundation be poured, the wooden skeleton rise. He is allowing the trap to build itself. Every nail driven is another stitch in the net. They move in on a bright Saturday. We feel the thud of their furniture, the patter of their footstep. We feel the soft, rhythmic pulse of the baby's heart from the nursery they painted a pale, sunny yellow. The baby's name is Lily. Her potential is a blinding star, a sun buried in the earth, and we are all eclipsed by it. The hunger twists inside me, a physical ache in my spectral bones. Months pass. They are happy, too happy. Their joy is a shield, and it frustrates Alana. She sends tendrils of unease into their dreams. A forgotten bill, a strange noise in the attic, a sudden baseless worry about Lily's health. But their love for each other, for their child, is a resilient thing. It repels the subtle attacks. They dismiss the cold spots in the hallway as bad insulation. They laugh off the nightmares. Louis understands. He changes his strategy. He does not attack their joy. He nurtures it. He makes their garden the most fertile on the street. Their roses bloom with impossible blood-red vibrancy. Their vegetables are large and perfect. Chloe tells her friends it's the magic of the soil. She has no idea. The peace he gives them is a deeper, more seductive quiet. It makes them stay home more. It makes them less suspicious. Mark builds a sandbox for Lily in the backyard. The first time her small, chubby hands sink into the sand, I feel a jolt, a connection far more profound than any we have made with the adults. She is pure, unformed consciousness. She is the most fertile ground of all. One afternoon, Chloe is gardening while Lily naps in a portable crib under the old oak tree. Our tree. The tree whose roots are now intertwined with Louis' own vast network. Chloe, kneeling in the dirt, feels a profound and beautiful connection to the earth. She feels like she is exactly where she is meant to be. This feeling is Louis' voice, whispered directly into her soul. She looks over at Lily and smiles. The baby is awake, quiet and content, staring up at the canopy of leaves. She is not babbling. She is perfectly, utterly still. Chloe feels a pang of something. Not fear, but a deep, melancholic love. She thinks her daughter looks like a little angel, too peaceful for this world. She has just had her first taste of our particular vintage. The love laced with loss. The joy touched by the quiet. That night, Mark is reading a bedtime story to Lily. He gets to a funny part, a line that always makes her giggle. But tonight, she doesn't giggle. She looks at him with her big blue eyes, and she is silent. She simply reaches out a hand and touches his cheek. Her touch is cold. Her expression is one of ancient, placid acceptance. It is not the look of a child. Mark's smile falters. A sliver of ice, fine as a needle, slips into his heart. He tells himself he is just tired. He finishes the story and tucks her in. Downstairs, Chloe is looking out the kitchen window, across the street at our overgrown mound. "It's so quiet over there," she says when Mark enters. "It's nice. Makes our home feel even more safe." Mark puts his arms around her, but he is still thinking of Lily's eyes, her cold little hand. He looks over Chloe's shoulder at the dark, silent mound. For a fleeting second, he does not see a patch of wild land. He sees a grave, and in the deep, dark earth, we feel it. The first real crack in their shield. The first true seed of dread. It is a small, bitter thing, and it is delicious. Louis is pleased. Alana is anticipatory. I am ready. The harvest is upon us again. The gate is opening, and this time the key is not grief, but the very love they thought would protect them. It is the most perfect key of all. The change in Lily was slow, a glacial creep into silence. She stopped crying first. The sharp, demanding wails that had once pierced our quiet were replaced by a watchful stillness. Then she stopped babbling. Her world became one of observation, her blue eyes taking in everything, giving nothing back. Mark and Chloe told themselves it was a phase, a leap in development. They called her their old soul. They had no idea how right they were. The house, their sanctuary, began to turn on them. It started with the smell. A rich, loamy scent of wet earth and decaying leaves that no amount of cleaning or air freshener could erase. Chloe found patches of moss growing in the corners of the laundry room, soft and cool to the touch. Mark, a rational man, blamed a leaky pipe, but the plumber found nothing. The foundation was dry. Their arguments began over nothing. A dish left in the sink. A forgotten errand. But the undercurrent was the unspoken fear that had taken root the night Lily touched Mark's cheek. They were afraid of their own child. They were afraid of the quiet she carried with her, a quiet that was slowly infecting their home, their marriage, their very thoughts. I feel their love curdling. It is a process I know intimately. The warmth turning to a cold, heavy lump. The tender words left unsaid, replaced by the loud, accusing silence. Alana feasts on this. She amplifies every sigh, every resentful glance. She is the chill that settles between them in their bed. Louis focuses on Lily. He is not corrupting her. He is awakening her. In the sandbox, she no longer builds castles. She draws slow, spiraling patterns in the sand, her finger guided by a will that is not her own. The patterns mirror the vast, subterranean network of roots that is Louis's true form. She is learning the map of her kingdom. One evening, Mark breaks. He is trying to get a laugh out of Lily, making silly faces. But she just stares back, her expression serene and utterly blank. "What is wrong with her?" he shouts, his voice cracking with a frustration that is really terror. Chloe flinches, And in that moment, a door slams shut between them. That night, Mark dreams. Lewis gives him the truth. He dreams of the old Victorian, of a man named Jeffrey climbing the stairs, of a boy with dark pools for eyes. He dreams of the burial, of the slow, patient consumption. He wakes with a gasp, the name Jeffrey on his lips, the taste of soil in his mouth. He knows. He doesn't understand how, but he knows what this land is. He stumbles into the hallway, determined to get his family and run. But the hallway has changed. The wallpaper is peeling, not to reveal drywall, but to the same wet, glistening earth I saw a century ago. The floorboards are soft under his bare feet. From Lily's half-open door, he hears a soft, humming sound. It is not a nursery rhyme. It is the sound of wind through deep, dark places. He pushes the door open. Lily is not in her crib. She is standing in the middle of the room, her small feet sinking into the floor, which has become a carpet of rich black soil. She is facing the wall, and where her hand touches it, the plaster is receding, flowing back into the earth from which it came. She turns her head. Her eyes are no longer blue. They are the deep, starless black of a midnight burial. "Daddy," she says, and her voice is the same soft, final whisper that Lewis used on me. "You can stay. It's quiet here now." Mark screams. It is a raw, tearing sound, a sound of pure, undiluted horror. It is the most beautiful sound I have heard in 100 years. Chloe appears behind him, her face a mask of confusion and dread. She sees her daughter, sees the room dissolving back into the earth, and her mind cannot process it. Her sanity, already strained, snaps. She does not scream. She simply walks past Mark, her steps slow and dreamlike. She kneels in the soft earth next to Lily and wraps her arms around her. "It's okay, baby," she whispers. "Mommy's here." I feel the moment of her surrender. It's a warm, soft wave that washes through the dark. She is offering herself. The land accepts. The soil in the room rises up around her legs, embracing her, drawing her in. She does not struggle. She rests her head against Lily's side and closes her eyes. Mark is still screaming, but the sound is becoming muffled, choked. The earth is rising up his legs, holding him fast. He is not being welcomed. He is being taken. His fear is too sharp, too violent. He is a struggle, not a surrender. Lily watches him, her dark eyes impassive. She raises her hand, and a tendril of root, white and thin as a nerve, breaks from the soil and gently touches his forehead. His screaming stops. His eyes go wide, then empty. The fight drains out of him. The soil covers him completely. The house is gone now. The walls, the roof, the memories, all subsumed. There is only the mound, slightly larger than before, and the quiet. Lily stands at its center, a small, pale flower in the dark. Alana's quartz presence is a satisfied hum. Lewis's network has grown, strengthened by this new, potent source. I am no longer just a memory. I'm a lineage, a tradition. The harvest is complete. The quiet is absolute. And we are, all of us, forever home. Story 2. The town of Stillwater was a place where time did not so much pass as it settled, like dust on a windowsill. That particular October, it seemed to have stopped altogether. The dawns were a perpetual gray smear at the eastern edge of the sky, a promise of morning that never quite arrived, leaving the nights to bleed into the days with a weary, bruised, purple light. The clocks, of course, continued their mechanical pantomime, their hands sweeping across bland numerals, but everyone felt the stagnation, a deep and fundamental pause in the world's turning. It was a held breath, a skipped heartbeat in the chest of the universe. For the children, this suspension was a tangible thing, a thickness in the air they had to push through on their walks to school. The air smelled of wet leaves and the cold, metallic tang of the Quinsigamond River that curled around the town like a sleeping serpent. Ethan, at 12, the oldest and the unspoken leader of their small tribe, felt it most acutely. He would lie in his bed at night, the digital numbers on his clock radio frozen at 3:17 a.m., and listen to the absolute silence. It was not an empty silence, but a full one. A silence that had weight and texture, like black velvet pressed against the ears. The others felt it too. Marie, whose sensitivity was not a weakness, but a different kind of sight, would wake with the taste of rust and old pennies in her mouth. Lucas, who usually filled any quiet with a stream of jokes and movie quotes, found his words drying up, his humor becoming thin and brittle. Andre, the observer, noted the strange behavior of the town's animals. The dogs had ceased their barking and now only watched from yards with dull, knowing eyes, and the birds had vanished entirely from the telephone wires. Demetrius, whose stutter worsened with fear, could barely speak above a whisper. Jasper, who had already lost his mother to a swift and brutal cancer, saw the lingering dawn as a familiar kind of grief, a refusal to let go. And Brett, who bore the bruises of his father's temper and the taunts of his peers, simply accepted it as another form of the oppression he knew so well. The first true omen came not as a sight, but as a sound. They were down in the quarry on the outskirts of town, their secret kingdom of crumbling granite and deep, rain-filled pools. It was Demetrius who heard it first, his head cocked, his small body tensed. He raised a trembling finger to his lips. The others fell silent. At first, there was only the drip of water from the quarry walls. Then, a soft, rhythmic scraping. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged over stone, a sound that spoke of immense effort and a terrible, patient purpose. It came from the network of storm drains that emptied into the quarry, a dark, brick-lined mouth that exhaled a breath of damp earth and something else, something sweetly rotten. Ethan, his heart a frantic bird in his cage of ribs, led them to the drain's entrance. The smell was stronger here, a cloying mixture of decay and, unmistakably, cheap candy. Lucas, trying to reclaim his role, muttered something about a dead raccoon, but the joke died in the thick air. Andre shone his flashlight into the tunnel. The beam illuminated slick brickwork and a trickle of black water, and there, just at the edge of the light, was a single pristine red balloon, bobbing gently, as if tugged by an unseen string. It was too bright, too clean for this place of decay. As they watched, it drifted deeper into the darkness, the scraping sound fading with it. The sightings began to accumulate after that, a slow accretion of dread. Jasper swore he saw his dead mother standing at the end of his street one twilight, her face a pale moon under her favorite blue hat. But when he ran to her, the figure melted into the shadows, leaving behind only the faint, lingering scent of her perfume, and a wet, slapping sound on the pavement. Brett, hiding from his father in the woods, saw a man who looked exactly like the town's kind, elderly pharmacist standing motionless between the trees, his face a slack, empty mask, his fingers elongating, curling around a birch trunk like pale, boneless worms. Marie had the worst of it. She woke one night to the feeling of being watched. Sitting up in her pink ruffled bed, she saw a figure in the corner of her room. It was her own reflection in her vanity mirror, but wrong. The reflection was smiling, a wide, toothy grin that was not her own. Its eyes were black pools, and as Marie watched, frozen in terror, the reflection slowly raised a finger to its lips, just as Demetrius had done in the quarry. The scent of rot and candy filled the room. The thing in the mirror then began to change, its features softening, shifting, its hair lightening, until it was no longer her, but a perfect likeness of her baby brother, sleeping in the next room. It winked one black eye, and then the mirror showed only her own terrified face once more. They gathered the next day in their fortress, a treehouse nestled in the sprawling oak in Ethan's backyard. The suspension of time was now a forgotten luxury. The world was moving again, but in a terrible, wrong direction. Andre, his voice quiet and precise, laid out his theory. He had been reading, he said. Old town records, forgotten folklore. He spoke of something that was old when the first settlers came to Stillwater. Something that lived in the spaces between things, in the cracks of reality. It had no true form of its own. It fed on fear, and it could become the things you loved most, or the things you feared the deepest. It was a mimic, a parasite of the psyche. It had been called many names, but the one that stuck in Andre's mind, the one he found in a crumbling diary in the town archives, was the grinning one. It was Demetrius, struggling to force the words past his lips, who gave it its modern face. LL likes the sea clown, he finally managed, his face pale with effort. It likes the F fun, the S smile. The revelation fell upon them with the force of a physical blow. The clown. It made a sick, perfect sense. The balloons, the sweet smell, the horrible, performative joy. It was a disguise, a costume it wore to make its predation more terrifying, to twist childhood's icons into things of nightmare. Their bond, forged in the shared crucible of schoolyards and summer adventures, now became their armor. Ethan's courage, Marie's intuition, Andre's intellect, Lucas' desperate humor, Jasper's hardened grief, Brett's silent endurance, and even Demetrius' fragile stutter. Each was a piece of the whole. They knew, with the absolute certainty of children, that the adults were blind to it. They moved through their lives in still water like sleepwalkers, their perceptions clouded by the entity's influence. They were on their own. The final descent began on the night the town's single, ancient clock tower finally stopped, its great hands seizing up at midnight. The unnatural stillness was shattered by a scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was Lucas who was taken. One moment he was with them, huddled in the treehouse. The next he was simply gone. The wooden planks where he had been sitting slick with a foul, oily water. The only clue was a single, hysterical laugh that echoed through the trees. A laugh that was not Lucas's, but a perfect, cruel imitation of it. There was no choice. They had to go down. The storm drains were the only way. Armed with flashlights, a knife taken from Brett's father's toolbox, and their own fraying nerve, they slipped into the earth, through the quarry entrance. The tunnel was a throat. The air was thick and wet, clinging to their skin and clothes. The walls wept of viscous, dark fluid, and the smell was overpowering. A slaughterhouse hidden beneath a candy store. The sound of dripping water was a constant, maddening percussion. They moved through a labyrinth of brick and concrete, their flashlight beams creating frantic, dancing shadows. They passed piles of bones, some animal, some disturbingly not. They saw discarded forms littering the passages, a tattered version of Jasper's mother propped against a wall, her chest a hollow cavity, a twisted, broken thing that had once worn the pharmacist's face. The entity was a profligate artist, trying on fears and discarding them when they were used up. They found it in a vast, circular chamber where several large tunnels met. The space was lit by a sick, phosphorescent glow from patches of fungus on the walls. In the center of the chamber stood a figure. It was the clown, but it was wrong in 1,000 subtle ways. Its suit was not bright satin, but a material that looked like wet, bruised flesh. Its ruff was a ring of pale, twitching fingers. Its face was a porcelain mask of glee, but the paint was cracked and peeling, and from the cracks seeped a black, tarry substance. Its eyes were not eyes, but deep, empty holes that seemed to swallow the light. In one hand, it held a bunch of the red balloons, their strings trailing like veins. At its feet lay Lucas, unconscious or worse, his skin pale and waxy. The thing did not move, but its voice echoed in their minds, a symphony of every fearful whisper they had ever heard. It knew them. It spoke of Ethan's secret fear of failing his friends, of Marie's terror of the dark spaces in her own mind, of Andres' cold dread of a universe without reason. It showed Brett the smiling, loving face of his father, and for a glorious second, Brett's face lit with a desperate hope before the face contorted into the familiar, drunken snarl. It showed Jasper his mother, whole and healthy, beckoning him into a warm, welcoming darkness. They were breaking. The entity fed on their despair, growing taller, its form shifting and blurring at the edges, becoming a composite of all their nightmares. Demetrius was sobbing, his stutter locking his terror inside him. Marie had her hands over her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. But Ethan, looking at his friends, at their shattered faces, found a core of steel within himself. He remembered what Andre had said. It fed on fear. It was a parasite. And a parasite could be starved. He did not shout. He did not attack. He simply spoke, his voice low and steady, cutting through the psychic cacophony. "We're not afraid of you." The entity's grinning mask twitched. The voice in their minds faltered. "You're just a hungry thing," Ethan continued, taking a step forward. "And we're not your food." He turned to his friends, his eyes meeting each of theirs. "Look at it. Don't look at what it shows you. Look at what it is. It's empty. It's nothing." It was the hardest thing any of them had ever done. To face the manifestation of their deepest sorrows and terrors, and to feel, not the cold grip of fear, but a hot, defiant pity. Jasper looked at the phantom of his mother and saw not her love, but the thing's pathetic need to use it. Marie opened her eyes and saw the black holes in the mask, not as infinite dread, but as a profound loneliness. Brett looked at the false face of his father and felt not terror, but a sorrow for the thing that had to steal such ugliness to feel powerful. They stood together, a line of children in a cavern under the world, and they refused to feed the darkness. The entity shrieked, a sound that was not a sound, but a rupture in the air. The grinning mask cracked down the middle, not like porcelain, but like a dried scab. The form beneath was a shifting, formless mass of darkness, a crawling chaos of mouths and tendrils and desperate, grasping shapes. It was starving. It was dying. The balloons in its hand popped one by one, not with a bang, but with a wet, sighing gasp. The thing that was not a clown unraveled, its substance dissolving into a black smoke that stank of ozone and forgotten graves. The chamber was silent. The phosphorescent glow on the walls faded, plunging them into a darkness relieved only by their trembling flashlight beams. Lucas stirred at their feet, coughing alive. They stumbled out of the drains as the real dawn, sharp and clear and golden, finally broke over still water. The clock tower began to chime, its bell ringing out across the town, marking the resumption of time. They were heroes, but they were heroes who carried a chill in their souls that the sun could never warm. They had looked into the void, and the void had looked back, and they had seen that it was, at its core, merely and terribly hungry. Years passed. Stillwater returned to its quiet rhythm. The children grew into adults, their bond forever sealed by the horror they had faced. They moved away, built lives, but they were marked. Ethan became a quiet, resolute man, a leader in his community. Marie became an artist, her paintings filled with a haunting, beautiful light. Andre became a historian, obsessed with forgotten folklore. Lucas's humor was quieter, more genuine. Jasper learned to carry his grief without being crushed by it. Brett broke the cycle of violence in his family. Demetrius, while he never lost his stutter completely, found a strength in his voice he never knew he had. They never spoke of what happened in the drains. They didn't need to. It was in their eyes when they met, a shared unspoken knowledge. Ethan was the last of them, an old man now, living alone in the house he had grown up in. Stillwater was changing, modernizing, but the old quarry was still there, fenced off and forgotten. He sat in his quiet living room one evening, the television off, the only light from a single lamp. He was tired, his bones aching with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather, and then he heard it. At first, he thought it was the drip of a faucet. He got up, his joints protesting, and checked the kitchen. The taps were dry. He returned to his chair. The sound came again. Drip, dight. It was closer now. It wasn't water. It was thicker, slower. Drip, diat. A cold dread, ancient and familiar, began to uncoil in his stomach. He looked towards the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The darkness there seemed deeper than it should be, a pool of absolute black. And from that darkness, the sound came again. Drip, dot-e. It was the sound of something heavy and wet, falling onto a hard surface. It was the sound from the quarry, from the drains, from the chamber of the grinning one. It was a sound that did not belong in his clean, quiet house. He did not move. He did not call for help that would not come. He simply sat in his chair, his hands gripping the worn arms, and listened. The sound was slow, patient, relentless. Drip. It was not getting closer. It was simply there, a punctuation mark in the silence of his life, a reminder that the hunger had never truly left, that it had only been waiting, down in the dark, biding its time, waiting for the fear to grow ripe again. Drip. Died. Ethan closed his eyes, and he listened. He listened as the sound began to change, to take on a new rhythm, a soft rhythmic scraping, like something heavy being dragged from the darkness of the hall toward the light of his lamp. Drip, and he listened. The scraping stopped just beyond the circle of lamplight. The air grew cold, so cold he could see his own breath pluming in the faint light. He kept his eyes closed. He would not give it the satisfaction. He would not look. He focused on the memory of his friends, their faces young and fierce in the quarry, their small hands linked in the dark. He held on to the feeling of their shared defiance, a tiny, warm ember in the vast cold that was filling the room. A smell began to permeate the air, not the cloying candy rot of before, but something drier, more ancient. It was the smell of dust and mothballs and old, brittle paper. It was the smell of his own attic, of things long boxed away and forgotten, and beneath that, the faint, sweet scent of his late wife's perfume, the one she always wore. A voice, thin and reedy, whispered from the hallway. It was not the symphony of terrors from the drain. It was a single voice, a perfect imitation of Sarah's. Ethan, I'm so cold. Why did you leave me all alone? The ember of defiance in his chest flickered. This was its new strategy. It had learned. Fear had not worked on them as children. So now it sought to devour him with grief, with loneliness, with the specific, aching sorrow of a long life lived without her. He felt a pressure on the arm of his chair, as if a small, cold hand had rested there. He could feel the ghost of her touch through the fabric of his sleeve. The scent of her perfume grew stronger. A heartbreakingly accurate replica. It's so dark where I am, Ethan. The voice whispered, closer now, right by his ear. Won't you come with me? It's time to come home. He could feel the pull of it, the seductive lure of an end to the loneliness, of a reunion in the dark. It would be so easy to open his eyes, to let go, to finally stop fighting. The thing was offering him the one thing he truly wanted, wrapped in the one thing he truly feared. The scraping started again, a slow, deliberate drag across his hardwood floor, circling his chair. He could feel its presence, a void of cold and silence, circling him like a shark. It was feeding on his internal struggle, on the war between his enduring love and his hardened will. He thought of Marie, of the last time he had seen her. Her hair gone white, her eyes still holding that deep, knowing light. She had taken his hand and said nothing, but her grip was firm. It was a reminder of their pact, their shared burden. He took a slow, shuddering breath, the cold air hurting his lungs. He focused not on the memory of Sarah's death, but on the memory of her life. He thought of her laughter in this very room, of the way she would hum while she gardened, of the warmth of her hand in his. He filled his mind with the light, not the darkness. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. It was not a shout of defiance, but a simple statement of fact. "You are not her, and I am not afraid." The pressure on the arm of the chair vanished. The scent of perfume twisted, curdling into the smell of damp earth. And that same ancient dust. The whispering stopped. The scraping ceased. For a long moment, there was only silence and the pounding of his own heart. Then, from the hallway, there came a new sound. It was a soft, dry rustle, like pages turning in a book. And then, a faint, sibilant hiss that was not of this world. A sound of pure, thwarted malice. It receded, pulling back into the deeper darkness from which it came, growing fainter and fainter until it was gone. The cold in the room began to dissipate. The lamplight seemed to brighten, pushing back the unnatural shadows in the hall. The drip had stopped. Ethan sat there for a long time, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. He had won again. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep into his old bones, that it was only a reprieve. It was patient. It was eternal. It would always be there, in the cracks, in the quiet moments, in the memories it could twist. It was waiting for the next generation of children to feel afraid in the dark, for the next old man to sit alone with his grief. It was the permanent resident of Stillwater, and he had merely been its caretaker. He opened his eyes and looked at the empty hallway, knowing he would be listening for the rest of his life. The silence that followed was the loudest he had ever heard. It was a presence in itself, a heavy blanket smothering the house. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his chair until the gray light of dawn filtered through the windows, bleaching the color from the world. The familiar objects of his life, the sofa, the bookshelf, the photograph of Sarah on the mantelpiece, all seemed like stage props, insubstantial and temporary. He made tea, his movements slow and automatic. The kettle whistled, a shrill, normal sound that felt obscene in the aftermath. He carried the cup to the kitchen table and sat, staring at the steam rising in a thin, wavering column. He thought about calling Marie. She was in a home now, her mind not what it once was. Would she even remember? Or would she just hear the fear in an old man's voice and become agitated? Andre was gone, passed in his sleep 2 winters ago. Lucas, just last year. He was the last century. The day passed with a leaden slowness. He tried to read the newspaper, but the words swam before his eyes, meaningless marks on a page. Every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind outside, was the beginning of that scraping sound. His heart would clench, and he would stop, listening, waiting for it to take shape again. It did not. By the late afternoon, a resolve hardened within him. He could not live like this, jumping at shadows, waiting for the next assault. He was too old for this war, but he was not too old to deliver one final message. He went to the basement, the steps groaning under his weight. In a corner, behind boxes of Christmas decorations, was an old metal lockbox. He brought it upstairs, the key hanging on a nail by the door, feeling cold in his hand. He placed the box on the kitchen table. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper, were the artifacts of that long-ago summer. A dried, brittle red balloon fragment. A sketch Marie had made of the thing in the drain, its lines frantic and fearful. Andre's carefully written notes on the grinning one. and a single group photograph of the 7 of them taken just a week before Lucas was taken. Their faces were young, but their eyes were already old. He took out a fresh piece of paper and a pen. His hand, which sometimes shook now, was steady. He wrote not for himself, but for whoever might come after. He wrote down everything: the quarry, the stop time, the treehouse, the drains, the chamber. He described the entity, its methods, its hunger. He wrote of their victory and of its inherent fragility. He ended with a single, stark sentence: "It does not die. It only waits." He folded the letter and placed it on top of the other relics in the box. He closed the lid and turned the key. He knew what he had to do. He could not leave this knowledge in his house, where it could be found by some well-meaning relative after he was gone and dismissed as the ramblings of a senile old man. It had to be hidden in the one place it belonged, the one place that would give it context and a warning. As twilight began to settle over Stillwater, Ethan took the lockbox and walked out of his house. He did not look back. He walked through the quiet streets, past houses with glowing windows, past families eating dinner, oblivious. He walked to the edge of town, to the old rusted fence that surrounded the quarry. He knew a way through, a place where the chain link was loose, remembered from 1,000 childhood dares. The quarry was deeper now, filled with murky rainwater and shadows. The air was still and cold. He stood at the edge, looking down into the dark water that hid the entrance to the drains. This was the place. This was where it began, and this was where the record of it should remain. He did not throw the box. He placed it carefully, reverently, in the hollow of a gnarled ancient oak tree whose roots clawed at the quarry's edge. It was hidden from casual view, but not from someone who was looking, someone who already knew the shape of the darkness. He patted the rough bark of the tree, a final, silent gesture. He turned and walked back toward the lights of the town. He felt a profound tiredness, but also a sliver of peace. He had done what he could. The story was safe. As he reached his street, he saw a young boy, no more than 8, riding his bike in circles under a street lamp. The boy looked up as Ethan passed, and for a moment, their eyes met. The boy's face was smudged with dirt, his expression one of simple, solitary concentration. He was alone. Ethan stopped. He wanted to say something, to warn him, to tell him to go home, to stay with others, to never, ever go down into the dark places. But the words stuck in his throat. The boy would not understand. He would just see a crazy old man. The boy gave him a curious look, then pedaled off into the gathering dark, the whir of his bike tires the only sound. Ethan watched him go until he disappeared around a corner. He stood there for a long time, under the yellow glow of the street lamp, listening to the silence of the town, a silence that was no longer silent to him. It was a canvas upon which any sound could be painted, and he knew the artist was still there, holding its brush, waiting for the right moment to begin a new masterpiece of terror. He finally turned and walked slowly back to his house, to his chair, to his vigil. The waiting was not over. It had just been passed on like a baton in a relay race that had no finish line. The next morning, the sun felt thin and unconvincing. Ethan moved through his routine with the precision of a ghost, each action feeling like a performance for an unseen audience. He kept the television on for the noise, a constant drone of cheerful morning shows that could not penetrate the chill that had taken root in him. He found himself staring at the hallway, at the exact spot where the scraping had stopped. There was nothing there, not even a scratch on the floorboards, but he could still feel the imprint of its presence, a stain on the air. A week passed, then 2. The memory of the event began to soften at the edges, blurring into the general ache of his years. He almost managed to convince himself it had been a particularly vivid dream, a final fever of an old mind. He started sleeping in his bed again, though he kept a lamp on. It was on a Tuesday, while he was taking out the trash, that he saw it. Tucked into the branches of the hedgerow that separated his yard from the neighbors was a single red balloon. It was fresh, taut with helium, its string tied in a perfect jaunty bow. It bobbed gently in the breeze, a splash of violent, cheerful color against the green leaves. His heart did not race. His breath did not catch. Cold, flat calm settled over him. This was not a memory. This was a message. It was not here for him, not really. He was the caretaker, the reminder. This was for the new ones. He looked down the street, his eyes scanning the houses. In a yard 3 doors down, the same boy he had seen under the street lamp was playing with a toy truck on the front steps. He was alone. Ethan walked slowly to the hedgerow. He reached out a trembling hand and untied the balloon from the branch. The string felt slick and cold. He did not pop it. He carried it carefully, like a live bomb, back into his house. He walked to the fireplace, long unused, and opened the flue. He held the balloon over the grate and released the string. It rose quickly, bumping against the sooty brick before disappearing up into the darkness of the chimney. He did not hear it pop. It was just dawn, swallowed by the house. He closed the flue and brushed the dust from his hands. He went to the window and looked out. The boy was still playing, oblivious. The hunger was testing the fences, looking for a new way in. It was learning new tricks, using new lures. It was patient. It was eternal. And Ethan, the last century, would watch and wait, knowing that his vigil would only end when he was no longer there to stand it. The town slept on, dreaming simple dreams, while in a quiet house on a quiet street, an old man stood guard against the creeping dark, a solitary figure in a world that had long forgotten the taste of true fear. He began to take walks at the same time every day, always past the house where the boy lived. He learned his name was Leo. He learned he was a quiet child, often by himself, his parents both working long hours. Ethan would nod, sometimes offer a piece of candy from the jar he started keeping in his pocket. But he never lingered. He was just the friendly, if somewhat distant, old man from down the street. He made sure of it. He saw other things, too. A lost dog poster that featured a drawing with an unsettling, toothy smile. A child's chalk drawing on the sidewalk of a figure with too many fingers. A puddle in a parking lot that, for a single heart-stopping moment, reflected a sky filled with red balloons instead of clouds. They were small things, easily dismissed as coincidence or imagination. But to Ethan, they were cracks in the world, tiny fissures through which the old hunger was beginning to seep. He thought about the lockbox often. Had it been the right thing? Or had he merely returned the infection to its source, like a doctor depositing a virus back into a well? He didn't know. He only knew that the knowledge could not be allowed to die with him. It had to exist somewhere, a seed of truth in a world of forgetting. One evening, he saw Leo sitting on his front step, not playing, just staring into the distance with a look of profound loneliness that Ethan recognized all too well. It was the same look he and his friends had worn, the look that had drawn the attention of the grinning one all those decades ago. The sight of it sent a jolt of pure, undiluted terror through his aged frame. It was starting again. The selection. He went home, his mind racing. He could not approach the parents. They would think he was mad. He could not tell Leo. The boy was too young, the truth too monstrous. He was trapped, a witness to a prelude he could not stop. That night, he dreamed of the drains. He was a boy again, and Marie, Andre, Lucas, all of them were with him, their small hands linked. But the chamber was different. The throne of refuse was gone. In its place stood a perfect, quiet suburban house. Its front door was open, and from the darkness within came the soft, rhythmic sound of a child crying. He tried to run, to warn them, but his feet were rooted to the spot. He looked down and saw that the floor of the cavern was not stone, but a massive grinning face, and they were all standing on its tongue. He woke with a gasp, the taste of dust and candy in his mouth. The house was silent. There was no drip, no scraping, but the feeling of the dream clung to him, a wet, psychic shroud. It was close. It was making its move. The next day, he saw Leo walking down the street, kicking a stone. He wasn't heading home. He was walking with a purpose, toward the edge of town, toward the quarry. Ethan watched from his window, his blood running cold. It was a perfect repetition, a cruel echo. He knew he had to follow. He was old and slow, but he was the only one who knew the path. He pulled on his coat, his fingers fumbling with the buttons, and stepped out into the afternoon, a lone, frail figure shadowing a small boy. Both of them walking toward the same dark heart that had, generations ago, chosen them both. He would not let the story end the same way. He would not. The distance to the quarry seemed to stretch and warp, each step an agony for Ethan's old joints. Leo moved with the unthinking certainty of a sleepwalker, his small form disappearing and reappearing between the trees. Ethan kept to the side of the road, his breath ragged, his mind a storm of fear and fractured memories. He saw not just Leo, but the ghost of Lucas, of himself, of all the children who had ever been called to that place. He lost sight of the boy as the road curved, and a spike of panic gave him a burst of speed. When he rounded the bend, the quarry fence was in view. But Leo was already there, his small hands working at the loose section of chain link, just as Ethan had done 60 years before. The boy wriggled through the gap with an ease that was terrifying. Ethan called out, his voice a dry croak. "Leo, stop!" The boy froze on the other side of the fence, turning to look at him with wide, confused eyes. There was no recognition of the danger, only a child's puzzlement at being followed by a strange old man. "I have to," Leo said, his voice small but firm. "He's lonely. He said I could see the shiny things." The words were a punch to Ethan's gut. The shiny things. It was the same promise, the exact same words it had used on Lucas. Ethan forced his old body through the same gap in the fence, the rusted metal tearing at his coat. He stumbled through and stood between Leo and the deep, dark water of the quarry. "Leo, listen to me," Ethan said, his voice low and urgent. He knelt, ignoring the protest in his knees, putting his face level with the boy's. "The man who told you that is a liar. He is not a man. He wants to hurt you. The shiny things are a trick." Leo's brow furrowed. He looked past Ethan, toward the water. "But he's right there." He's smiling. Ethan did not turn around. He knew there would be nothing there for him to see. It only showed itself fully to the children, to the vulnerable. It was showing Leo a friend. He gripped the boy's shoulders, not hard, but firmly. "Look at me, Leo. Don't look at him. Look at me. What is your mother's name?" The question was so mundane, so out of place, that it broke the boy's concentration. "Jenny," he mumbled, his eyes flicking back to Ethan's face. "And what does she make for you that you love the most?" "Pancakes. On Sundays, with little chocolate chips." A tiny spark of life returned to his eyes, a connection to the world of light and warmth. "That's right," Ethan said softly. "That's real. That is what is real. The thing behind me is a shadow. It feeds on loneliness. It tells you you are special, so it can make you alone forever. I know because it told me the same thing when I was your age." Leo was listening now, the spell broken by the simple, solid truth of chocolate chip pancakes. He was scared, but it was a human fear, not the seductive lure of the void. A cold wind whipped across the quarry then, stirring the dead leaves and sending a ripple across the dark water. It carried a sound, a faint, sibilant whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was not a word, but a feeling of pure, spiteful anger. Ethan stood up, his body aching. He took Leo's small, cold hand in his. "We are leaving now, and we are not going to look back. Do you understand? No matter what you hear, no matter what it promises, we do not look back." He turned and led the boy back toward the fence, walking slowly, deliberately. He could feel the thing's gaze on his back, a pressure like ice. He heard a rustle from the old oak tree where he had hidden the lockbox. He heard a soft, wet chuckle from the direction of the drains. He kept walking, pulling Leo gently along. The boy was trembling, but he kept his eyes fixed on the fence on the way out. They squeezed back through the gap and stumbled onto the solid gravel of the road. The sun, which had felt so weak before, now felt like a blessing on their faces. Leo began to cry, quiet, shuddering sobs of confusion and relief. Ethan put a hand on his shoulder and guided him home. He delivered Leo to his mother, a tired-looking woman named Jenny, who thanked Ethan profusely for finding her son, who had wandered off. Ethan simply said the boy had seemed lost, and that it was no trouble. He offered no other explanation. He walked back to his own silent house, the weight of the years heavier than ever before. He had intervened. He had changed the story. But as he sat in his chair, the old familiar dread settling around him once more, he knew the balance had been upset. He had drawn a line in the sand, and the tide was now turning, preparing to wash it away. The grinning one did not like to be denied. Its attention, once a diffuse hunger, was now sharpened and focused squarely on him. The final siege was beginning. Story 3. The first thing was the silence. It was not the mere absence of sound, but a presence in itself. A heavy woolen blanket that had been thrown over the world, muffling the cries of gulls and the gentle lap of water against the shore. Mark felt it before he understood it. A subtle tightening of the skin on the back of his neck, a primal instinct that made the fine hairs there stand at attention. He stopped on the narrow, pine-needle-strewn path and held up a closed fist, the signal for the boys behind him to halt. His breath, which a moment before had been a steady, rhythmic comfort in his own ears, seemed to slow and thicken in his chest. He listened, turning his head slowly, his eyes scanning the dense, shadowed wall of spruce and fir that flanked the trail. There was nothing to see, nothing but the deep, shifting greens and the skeletal gray of birch trunks. Yet the feeling persisted, a cold, invisible finger tracing the line of his spine. It was the sensation of being watched, not by a single pair of eyes, but by the island itself. They were a troop of 8, plus Mark, their scoutmaster, a man whose youthful features were beginning to be etched with the fine lines of responsibility. They had come to this remote, unnamed island in the vast, cold expanse of a northern lake for a weekend of orienteering and survival skills, a final test before the autumn chill locked the region in ice. The boys, a mix of adolescents ranging from 12 to 16, were initially boisterous, their voices cracking with excitement as the boat that dropped them off receded into the mist that perpetually clung to the water. Now, in the profound quiet, their bravado had evaporated, replaced by a wary, watchful tension. They stood in a loose line behind Mark, their oversized backpacks making them look like a row of patient tortoises. Harris, the oldest and largest of them, broke the silence, his voice a low grumble that seemed to violate the sacred hush. "What is it? See a squirrel?" Mark lowered his hand, forcing a calm he did not feel into his own voice. "Nothing. Nothing. Just getting my bearings. The map says the old ranger cabin should be just ahead. Let's move." They pressed on, the feeling of unseen observation a cold stone in Mark's gut. The air was damp and carried the rich, decaying scent of moss and wet earth, a smell that usually comforted him, but now felt cloying, almost suffocating. They found the cabin nestled in a small clearing, a squat, dark structure of weathered logs with a sagging roof. It was exactly as described, a relic from a time when the Forestry Service still patrolled these waters. But it felt wrong. The single window beside the heavy wooden door was a black, vacant eye, and the silence around it was even deeper, as if the clearing were a bubble of dead air. It was Anthony who found the thing in the water. Anthony was small for 14, a quiet boy with glasses and a mind that preferred the clear logic of star charts and knot-tying manuals to the messy complexities of his peers. While the others began the work of clearing the cabin of cobwebs and animal droppings, Anthony had wandered down to the narrow, rocky beach that curved away from the cabin's front. He came back at a run, his face pale, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Mark," he said, his voice trembling. "Mark, you have to come see." "What is it, Tony?" Mark asked, his hand on the boy's shoulder. "I don't know. It's in the water, by the big rock." Mark followed him, Harris and a few of the other boys trailing behind with a morbid curiosity. The thing was caught in a tangle of driftwood and lakeweed, bobbing gently in the shallow, ice-cold water. At first, it was difficult to comprehend what they were seeing. It was roughly the size of a large dog, but its shape was utterly alien. It seemed to be a mass of glistening, translucent flesh, shot through with pulsing veins of a deep, bruised purple. Parts of it were studded with what looked like dark, unblinking fish eyes, while other sections were a chaotic mosaic of what might have been fur, scales, and chitinous plating, all fused together in a nightmare of biology. A low, wet, sucking sound emanated from it, a sound like a heart beating in mud. From its core, a network of fine root-like tendrils, pale and sickly, extended into the water, swaying with a gentle, searching motion. "What the hell is that?" Harris whispered, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a raw, unvarnished revulsion. "I don't know," Mark said, his own stomach clenching. "Some kind of carcass. A mutation. Don't touch it." But Anthony had already been close. He stood a few feet back, shivering, and when Mark looked at him, he saw the boy compulsively rubbing his right hand with his left. I poked it with a stick," Anthony admitted, his voice small. "A piece of it came off. It got on my hand. It stung." Mark took the boy's hand. There was a small, faint pink smear on the back of it, like a drop of diluted jelly. It didn't look like much, but a cold dread, colder than the lake water, began to seep into Mark's bones. "Get the first aid kit," he said to no one in particular. "Clean it thoroughly. Use the antiseptic." The night fell quickly, a deep, starless velvet that pressed against the cabin's single window. The boys huddled inside, the air thick with the smell of canned beans heating on a camp stove and the underlying coppery tang of fear. Anthony had grown quiet, then quietest of all. He sat in a corner, wrapped in a sleeping bag, shivering despite the warmth of the wood stove. Mark checked on him periodically, placing a hand on his forehead. It was cold and clammy, his skin waxy and pale. "You feeling okay, Tony?" Mark asked, his voice low. "My hand feels funny," Anthony murmured. "It feels full." Mark shone his flashlight on the boy's hand. In the stark beam, he saw it. The pink smear had darkened to a livid red, and from its center, a pattern of fine black lines was beginning to spread, tracing the paths of his veins up towards his wrist. The skin around it was taut and shiny, as if stretched over something growing beneath. "We need to get him out of here," Mark said, his voice tight. "First light, we signal for the pickup boat. It's 2 days early, but this is..." He was interrupted by a sound from Anthony. A wet, guttural cough that was not a cough at all. It was the same wet, sucking sound the thing on the beach had made. Anthony's eyes, when they opened, were wide and unseeing. The pupils dilated into black pools that seemed to absorb the light. A string of thick, clear fluid dripped from his slack lip. Harris stood up, his bulk casting a long, menacing shadow on the wall. He pointed a thick finger at Anthony. "He's sick. He's got something from that thing. We can't have him in here." "He's one of us, Harris," Mark said, his voice rising. "We look after our own." "He's not one of us anymore," Harris shot back, his eyes gleaming with a new, terrifying light, a light of opportunity found in chaos. "Look at him. He's a biohazard. We should put him outside." A furious argument erupted, the boys splitting into factions, their voices high and strained with panic. Mark's authority, once solid, was crumbling like old brick. In the midst of the shouting, Anthony began to convulse. His body arched off the floor, his limbs thrashing. And then, with a sound like tearing canvas, the skin on his forearms split open. But there was no blood. Instead, a mass of those same pale, root-like tendrils erupted from the wound, writhing and questing in the air, feeling their way blindly through the dim cabin light. The screaming started then, a single unified chord of pure terror. The boy scrambled back, overturning the stove, sending a spray of hot beans across the floor. The thing that had been Anthony rolled onto its hands and knees, its movements jerky, puppet-like. Its head lolled, and from its mouth poured a cascade of the translucent, jelly-like substance, which hit the wooden floor with a soft, wet slap, and immediately began to steam and bubble, eating into the wood. Harris was the first to act. He didn't scream. He didn't hesitate. He snatched up a heavy hatchet they had used for splitting kindling, and with a roar of pure, unadulterated fury, he brought it down on the twitching form. The blade sank deep into the thing's back with a sickening wet thud. There was no cry of pain, only a renewed, more vigorous writhing. And then, a droplet of the black-purple fluid that sprayed from the wound landed on Harris' cheek. He screamed then, a different kind of scream, one of agony and shock. He clawed at his face, but the fluid was already sizzling, burning through skin and flesh with a horrifying speed. It was consuming him. The infection, the parasite, the whatever it was, did not just transform. It devoured. It used its host as fuel, breaking it down into more of itself. "Get out," Mark yelled, his voice cutting through the panic. "Everyone out. Now!" They burst from the cabin into the cold night, the sounds of Harris's diminishing screams and the wet, scrabbling sounds of the Anthony thing chasing them into the dark. The island was no longer just silent. It was listening. The trees themselves seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers pointing accusingly at the fleeing boys. The feeling of being watched was now a certainty, a palpable, malevolent pressure from every shadow. What followed was a desperate, nightmarish flight through the woods. They had no plan, no destination, only the primal urge to put distance between themselves and the cabin. Mark tried to rally them, to lead them to the high ground, to the prearranged emergency signal point, but fear had picked them apart. One boy, tripping over a root, fell and did not get up. When Mark went back for him, he found him already being enveloped by a creeping, gelatinous film that had spilled from a patch of moss, his muffled cries quickly silenced. The island, they realized with a dawning cosmic horror, was not just a location for the outbreak. It was the source. The thing in the water was not an anomaly. It was a seed, or perhaps a spore. The very ecosystem was compromised. They saw patches of the forest floor that shimmered with an unnatural phosphorescence, and trees whose bark was peeling away to reveal the same pulsing, veined flesh. The parasite was a unifier, a horrifying synthesis, breaking down the barriers between species and converting all organic matter into its own, singular, dreadful form. Their numbers dwindled. One boy, driven mad by fear, ran screaming into the lake and was dragged under by a tangle of those pale, searching tendrils that now infested the water near the shore. Another simply vanished, his disappearance marked only by a single, choked-off cry, swallowed by the immense, watching dark. By the next dawn, only Mark and two others remained, huddled in a shallow cave overlooking the lake. They were filthy, exhausted, their eyes hollow with a terror that had moved beyond screaming into a silent, numb acceptance. The mist had returned, a thick, gray soup that obscured everything beyond a few feet. From within it, they could hear things moving. Not the familiar sounds of wildlife, but the slithering, scraping, sucking sounds of the new life that had taken possession of the island. "We're not going to make it, are we?" One of the boys whispered, his voice raspy from thirst and suppressed sobs. Mark didn't answer. He was watching the mist at the mouth of the cave. It was beginning to coalesce, to take on form. It seemed to him that the very vapor was thickening, drawing itself together into a shifting, nebulous shape that towered above the trees. It had no definite features, only a suggestion of a vast, silent head, and countless drifting limbs that were at once solid and made of fog. It was the island, or its soul, or the collective consciousness of the consuming organism. It was the watcher they had felt from the very beginning. It did not move toward them with malice. It simply was. Its presence was a statement of fact, an announcement of a process that was now complete. Resistance was not just futile. It was a misunderstanding of the fundamental order of things. The horror was not in being killed, but in being absorbed, in having your memories, your fears, your very selfhood dissolved into the great, silent, watching whole. Mark felt a strange peace settle over him, a resignation that was colder and more final than any fear. He looked at the boys, saw the same understanding dawning in their wide, glassy eyes. There was no escape. There was only the choice of how one was consumed. The mist figure began to slowly dissipate, its substance flowing back into the general gray of the morning. But the feeling of its gaze remained, a weight upon their souls. The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before, a silence that was not empty, but full of a single terrible, unspoken thought. Later, when the scheduled boat finally arrived, the men on board found the island perfectly still and quiet. They called out, their voices swallowed by the trees. They found the cabin empty, a cold wood stove, and a spilled can of beans the only signs of recent habitation. There was no sign of a struggle, no bodies, no evidence of the boys or their scoutmaster. It was as if they had simply vanished into the clean, pine-scented air. One of the rescuers, a local man with a weathered face, knelt by the water's edge, his eyes scanning the shoreline. He saw nothing out of the ordinary, just rocks and water and the endless, patient trees. But as he stood to leave, his boots scuffed a patch of damp earth near a large gray rock. He looked down. There, pressed into the soft soil, was a single, perfect scout neckerchief, folded into a tidy triangle. It was clean, dry, and placed there with an unmistakable, deliberate care. It was the only thing they found. He picked it up, a cold confusion settling in his gut, and he could not have said why the sight of that simple, orderly square of cloth filled him with a dread so profound and so inexplicable that he would wake from nightmares about it for the rest of his life. The boatman, whose name was Eli, held the neckerchief in his calloused hand. The fabric was a bright, cheerful blue, a stark and mocking contrast to the deep, primordial greens and grays of the island. He turned it over. It was pristine. It had not been torn free in a struggle or dropped in a frantic flight. It had been placed, a message or a marker. But for whom, and for what purpose, he could not fathom. His partner, a younger man named Jake, called from the cabin doorway. "Nothing in here, Eli. Just quiet." Eli didn't reply. His eyes were fixed on the trees, on the way the mist clung to the branches like cobwebs. The silence was getting inside his head, a low, humming pressure in his ears. He had spent his whole life on this lake, knew its moods and its secrets, but this was different. This was a wrongness, a void where the familiar sounds of life should have been. No scolding squirrels, no rustle of birds in the undergrowth, just the immense, watchful hush. Maybe they got lost, tried to swim for it, Jake suggested, his voice too loud, a crack in the oppressive calm. No, Eli said softly. His gaze drifted back to the water by the big rock. The water was clear, cold, and empty. There was no sign of the thing Anthony had found. But as he stared, he thought he saw, just for a second, a faint, oily shimmer on the surface, a rainbow sheen like that of a dying jellyfish. It was gone before he could point it out. "We should sweep the perimeter," Jake said, his bravado a thin shield. "They can't have just disappeared." Eli finally pocketed the neckerchief, the cloth feeling unnaturally cold against his thigh. "We'll do a sweep, but we stick together. No separating. Not for anything. No. They moved along the path, their boots crunching unnaturally loud on the fallen needles. Eli led the way, his shotgun held at a ready, low angle, though what he intended to shoot he didn't know. Jake followed close behind, his own rifle held tight. The forest seemed to press in on them, the trees standing too close, their branches intertwining like bony fingers. Eli kept seeing movement from the corner of his eye, a flicker of pale color, a shifting shadow. But when he snapped his head around, there was never anything there. Just more trees, more silence. They found the cave after an hour of searching. The entrance was a dark maw in the mossy hillside, and there, scattered at its mouth, were 3 backpacks. They were laid out in a neat row, side by side, their contents emptied and sorted with an almost military precision. Canteens, compasses, packets of dried food, a first aid kit, all arranged with a care that was utterly at odds with the panic of a lost troop. It was the work of someone or something that had all the time in the world. Jake knelt, picking up a compass. The glass was cracked and the needle inside spun in a slow, lazy circle, never settling. "What the hell, Eli? What is this?" Eli didn't answer. He was looking into the darkness of the cave. A faint, sweet, and putrid smell wafted out, like spoiled meat and blooming fungus. And there was a sound, the softest exhalation of air, a sigh that seemed to come from the rock itself. It was a sound of completion, of satisfaction. "Don't go in there," Eli said, his voice a dry rasp. "But they might be. They're not." Eli's tone brooked no argument. He took a step back, his skin crawling. He could feel it now, the same presence Mark had felt, but he understood it better. It wasn't just watching them. It was assessing them, cataloging them. The neatly folded neckerchief, the ordered row of packs. It was all part of a process. A terrible, patient tidiness. He backed away, pulling Jake with him. "We're leaving now." "But the boys..." "There are no boys," Eli snapped, the words echoing sharply in the stillness before being swallowed whole. "There's just this place. We need to get back to the boat. We need to report this." Their retreat was a near run, a frantic stumble back down the path, their necks prickling with the sensation of 1,000 unseen eyes tracking their every move. The island felt different on the return journey. It felt aware of their intention to leave, and it did not like it. The mist began to thicken, coiling down from the trees to pool on the path, making the familiar trail treacherous and strange. Once, a low-hanging branch, slick with the same oily moisture Eli had seen on the water, brushed against Jake's arm. He cried out, not in pain, but in revulsion. And when Eli looked, the fabric of his jacket was steaming slightly, a patch of it dissolving into a sticky, clear goo. They reached the pebbled shore where their boat was tied, their lungs burning. The world had shrunk to a small circle of gray water and the comforting solid shape of their aluminum skiff. They practically fell into it, Eli fumbling with the knot, his fingers numb and clumsy. The motor coughed to life, a violent, welcome noise that shattered the silence. Eli gunned it, swinging the boat away from the shore, pointing its nose toward the open lake and the distant, safe shore. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Jake, however, did. He looked back at the receding island, a dark smudge in the mist, and he saw them. For just a moment, the fog on the shoreline parted. Standing there, in a silent, perfectly straight line, were 8 figures. They were indistinct, their forms blurred as if seen through a wet pane of glass, but he could make out their outlines, the general shape of boys and a man. They were not moving. They were not waving for help. They were just watching the boat depart. And as the last of the mist closed around them, Jake saw, or thought he saw, their faces. They were no longer faces of terror or pain, but of a serene, empty calm. Their eyes were dark, reflective pools. And then they were gone, absorbed back into the gray, and the island was once again just a silent wooded mound in a vast, cold lake. Jake turned away, his body trembling. He said nothing to Eli, who was focused only on the horizon ahead. There were no words for what he had seen. There was only the memory, and the chilling, absolute certainty that the folded blue neckerchief in Eli's pocket was not a plea for help. It was a receipt. The boat cut through the placid water, the putter of its motor, the only sound in the vast gray world. Eli stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the tiller, his mind a locked box refusing to open. Jake sat hunched in the bow, his arms wrapped around himself, trying to stop the shaking that had taken root deep in his bones. He could still see them, those still, silent figures on the shore, their collective gaze a weight on his soul. They hadn't been rescued. They had been collected. Back on the island, the silence settled once more. It was a different silence now, not one of waiting, but of possession. In the cave, the sweet, putrid smell slowly faded, replaced by the clean, damp scent of stone and earth. The meticulously arranged backpacks were now gone, absorbed back into the forest floor without a trace. The process was complete. The island had digested its meal. Near the large gray rock by the water's edge, the patch of soil where Eli had found the neckerchief was now undisturbed. But if one were to look very closely, to press an ear to the ground, one might hear a faint, almost melodic hum, a vibration that was the sound of a system functioning in perfect terrible harmony. A single, pale tendril, no thicker than a thread, broke the surface of the soil, tasting the air. It wavered for a moment, then retracted, its purpose served. The scout troop was no more. Its components had been redistributed, its memories and patterns integrated into the whole. The knowledge of knots, of campfire songs, of the constellations, it was all there now, part of the island's quiet, growing intelligence. Days later, in a small town on the mainland, the official report was filed. Missing persons, presumed drowned in the lake. A tragedy. Eli and Jake gave their statements, their words clipped and evasive. They offered no theories, no hints of the unimaginable. To speak of it felt like a violation of a fundamental law, like shouting in a sacred space. The folded neckerchief was placed into evidence, a mundane artifact in a profoundly mysterious case. But the story did not end with the filing of a report. That night, Jake woke from a dead sleep, his heart hammering. He had dreamed of the lake, not as a place of water and wood, but as a single vast eye, and the island was its pupil, fixed and dark. And from that pupil, he heard a sound, a whisper that was not a sound at all, but a thought implanted directly into his mind. It was a single, simple phrase, the same phrase Mark had heard in his final moments, the core directive of the organism. Become part of the quiet. He got out of bed and went to his small bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, expecting to see horror, but his own eyes looked back, tired and normal. It was just a dream, he told himself. Just the stress. But as he turned to leave, his gaze fell upon the damp washcloth he had used. It was folded, a perfect, neat square, placed deliberately in the center of the sink. He had no memory of doing it. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He looked back at the mirror, and for a fleeting second, his reflection did not move with him. It remained still, its expression serene and empty, its eyes like dark pools. Then it blinked, and the moment was gone. Jake stood there, alone in the humming silence of his own home, and understood the true nature of the horror. It wasn't confined to the island. The island had simply been the point of contact. The infection was not of the body, but of the concept of separation itself, and it had found a new vector. It was patient. It was quiet. And it was already here. He did not scream. The sound caught in his throat, a dry, useless rasp. He stared at the folded washcloth, a simple domestic object that had become a tombstone for his former self. The thing inside him, the quiet thing, did not like screaming. It preferred order. It preferred silence. He reached out a hand that felt only distantly like his own, and smoothed a tiny, errant fiber on the cloth, perfecting its alignment. At the police station the next day, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken dread. Eli was already there, his face a grim mask. He looked at Jake, and in that single glance, a lifetime of understanding passed between them. Eli's were haunted, but they were still his own. Jake's, he knew, were not. "They're calling off the search," Eli said, his voice low. "The lake's too big. They're calling it a accident." Jake just nodded. It was the correct conclusion, the logical one. The quiet approved. Later, as Jake walked back to his small lakeside cabin, he found his steps slowing. He wasn't tired. He was, listening. The world was different. The chatter of squirrels was an irritating static. The lapping of waves on the shore was a rhythmic, soothing lullaby. He stopped by a puddle left by a recent rain. He stared into its murky depth, and for a long time, he did not see his reflection. He saw the island. He saw the 8 figures standing on the shore, and he saw an empty space beside them. A space that was waiting. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't a compulsion or a command. It was a simple, elegant realization, like understanding the solution to a math problem. He was a loose thread. His presence here, his knowledge, was a dissonant note in the perfect silence. He belonged to the whole. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, he dragged his old canoe into the water. He did not pack a bag. He did not bring a paddle. He simply stepped into it and sat down, his hands resting on his knees. The current of the lake, or something deeper and more intentional moving within it, caught the bow of the canoe and slowly, inexorably, began to turn it. It pointed towards the dark, brooding shape of the island in the distance. He felt no fear as the shore receded. The lights of the town twinkled, small and frantic, like the last firing of dying neurons. Then a low fog, smelling of pine and deep, wet earth, began to rise from the water, enveloping him. It muted the world, absorbing sound and light, until there was only the gentle rocking of the canoe and the profound, welcoming quiet. On the shore, Eli stood watching until the fog and the gathering dark swallowed the last speck of the canoe. He felt a profound emptiness, but also a strange, terrible relief. He had not been chosen. He had been left as a witness, a silent keeper of a truth that could never be told. He turned and walked back to his truck, the gravel crunching loudly under his boots. The sound was an offense. He found himself holding his breath, listening for something else, something more. But there was only the wind, and beneath it, the immense and patient silence, waiting for the rest of the world to finally and quietly fall in line. He drove home through the deepening twilight, the headlights cutting weak tunnels in the gloom. His own house felt alien. The hum of the refrigerator, an obscene noise in the sacred stillness that now filled his head. He sat in his armchair, not turning on a lamp, and let the dark seep into him. The folded neckerchief in his pocket seemed to pulse with a cold energy, a tiny, concentrated knot of the island's essence. He knew he should destroy it, burn it, throw it into the lake, but his hands would not obey. To do so would be an act of violence, a disruption. It was a part of the whole now, and he was its custodian. He took it out and laid it on the small table beside his chair. The neat blue triangle was a focal point in the swirling dark. As he stared at it, the frantic edges of his fear began to smooth away, sanded down by an encroaching calm. It was easier this way, to stop fighting, to listen. The next morning the phone rang. It was the sheriff, his voice gruff with a new concern. Jake's neighbor had reported his canoe missing, and Jake himself was nowhere to be found. Eli listened, his gaze fixed on the neckerchief. "He was shook up," Eli said, his voice flat and distant even to his own ears. "Probably just went off to clear his head. He'll turn up." He hung up before the sheriff could ask more questions. He spent the day in a state of suspended animation. He ate because it was necessary. He breathed because the process continued. But his real attention was turned inward, toward the quiet, and outward, toward the lake. He found himself standing at his window for hours, watching the water. It no longer looked like a body of water. It looked like a membrane, a shimmering skin over something immense and dormant. 2 days later, they found Jake's canoe. It had washed ashore on the opposite side of the lake, miles from the island. It was empty, of course, and perfectly dry. Inside, placed precisely in the center of the forward thwart, was a single water-smoothed stone. There was no note, no sign of struggle, just the canoe and the stone, a arrangement as deliberate and meaningless as the folded neckerchief. The official search for Jake was brief. Another tragedy on the big lake. The community mourned, then moved on. The two incidents filed away as separate, unfortunate mysteries. Eli did not mourn. He understood. Jake had been completed. He had gone to his place in the pattern. The stone in the canoe was not a message. It was a receipt, just like the neckerchief. A confirmation of transfer. Life continued. But for Eli, it was a performance. He ran his boat. He spoke to people. He went through the motions of a man living his life. But inside, the quiet was growing. He began to find small, ordered things in his wake. A stack of firewood, perfectly symmetrical and balanced up. The cans in his cupboard all facing the same direction, labels out. He had no memory of doing these things. It was the quiet, organizing the world through him, making the chaotic flow of his existence neat and tidy. He stopped going into town. The noise of it, the chaotic jumble of separate minds and competing desires, was physically painful. He preferred the silence of his cabin, the company of the lake. He would sit for hours, and sometimes he would hear it, a low, resonant hum that was not a sound but a feeling, a vibration that connected him to the island, to Jake, to the boys, to the vast, watching whole. He was not a prisoner. He was a node in a network, a sentinel. One evening, as a thick fog rolled across the water, he walked down to his dock. He didn't need a boat. He simply stood at the very end, the planks cold and damp under his bare feet. The fog enveloped him, and in its embrace, the last shreds of his individual self dissolved. He was not Eli anymore. He was the watcher on the shore. He was the memory of the lake. He was the quiet. And he was waiting. The world was so very loud, and it was only a matter of time before it too learned the peace of silence. The seasons turned. The summer heat gave way to the crisp decay of autumn, and then the deep freeze of winter locked a lake in an iron silence. Eli's cabin remained dark, the mail piled up inside the box until the door would no longer close. The sheriff drove out once, knocked on the door, and peered through a window. He saw nothing out of place. The interior was neat, austere. It looked, he thought, like someone had left on a long trip. He filed the report. Another one gone. The big lake claimed them in its own ways. On the first warm day of spring, a pair of hikers, new to the area, paddled their kayaks out towards the island. They had heard the stories, the local legends of the lost scout troop, and they felt the thrill of safe, imagined danger. As they approached the pebbled shore, one of them pointed. "Look." A man stood by the large gray rock. He was tall and still, dressed in worn, neutral-colored clothing that seemed to blend with the stone and the trees. He did not wave or call out. He simply watched them approach. "Hello?" The lead hiker called out, her voice too loud in the stillness. The man did not answer. He offered a slow, deliberate nod, then turned and walked into the trees. His movement was fluid, silent. He did not seem to be in a hurry, but he was gone in an instant, absorbed by the deep green of the forest. "Creepy," the other hiker muttered. "Let's just eat lunch and go." They had pulled their kayaks ashore and sat on the sun-warmed stones. The island was beautiful, peaceful. The air was clean. After they ate, the woman gathered their trash, a granola bar wrapper, a plastic baggie, and stuffed it into her pocket. As she stood, she noticed something nestled between the roots of a large pine tree. It was a small, perfect pyramid of smooth, gray stones. It was too symmetrical to be natural, too deliberate to be an accident. It felt like a marker or an altar. A profound unease settled over them both. The peace of the island now felt like a held breath. They launched their kayaks and paddled hard for the mainland, not speaking until their blades scraped the familiar sand of the public beach. They never saw the man again, but he saw them. From the shadows of the trees, Eli watched them go. There was no malice in his gaze, only a quiet assessment. They had left a small, messy vibration in the air, a ripple of disquiet. But they had also taken something with them, a seed of the silence. The woman would find herself, days later, compulsively organizing her spice rack. The man would wake in the night, hearing not a sound, but the absence of one. A silence so deep it felt like a presence in his room. The process was slow. It was patient. And on the island, the quiet hummed its low, resonant note, a frequency that was slowly tuning the world. One folded piece of cloth, one stacked stone, one quiet man at a time. Story 4. The wind came first, not as a gust or a breath, but as a presence. It slipped through the cracked window frame of the third-floor apartment, a long, low exhalation that carried the scent of wet brick and distant, decaying leaves. It did not howl. It whispered, threading itself through the silence of the new rooms. A sound so intimate, it felt like a secret being pressed into the ear of the building itself. To Gracie, standing in the center of the empty living room, it sounded like a question. Austin heard only the traffic 4 stories below, the sound of their new life in the city beginning. The apartment on Alder Street was a find, a steal, a stroke of impossible luck. The real estate agent had used those exact words, her smile a little too wide, her eyes a little too vacant. The building was old, a hulking structure of soot-stained brownstone with a foyer that always smelled of boiled cabbage and lavender polish. Their neighbors were quiet, mostly elderly, their lives conducted behind thick doors in a series of hushed movements and muffled radio voices. Except for the Vances in 3B next door. Arthur and Eleanor Vance were not quiet, not elderly. And their kindness, which arrived the day they moved in with a still warm loaf of banana bread, felt less like a welcome and more like a claim. Arthur was a large man, soft-spoken, with hands that seemed to absorb the light. Eleanor was small, bird-like, her eyes a pale, liquid blue that never seemed to blink. They were, they explained, the building's longest tenants, its caretakers, in a way, its memory. They knew all the little quirks, the way the hot water took 5 full minutes to travel up the pipes, the particular rattle the west-facing window made when a storm was coming. They knew the building's heartbeat. Gracie's pregnancy was the second stroke of luck, announced just 2 months after they'd unpacked the last box. Austin, an architect whose dreams were rapidly outpacing his salary, saw it as a sign, a cosmic alignment of fortune. He started working later, taking on projects with shadowy, well-paying clients, coming home with the smell of expensive scotch on his breath and a new calculating light in his eyes. Gracie, a photographer, found her work turning inward. The city outside their windows lost its charm, becoming a grainy, monochrome tableau. Her world shrank to the dimensions of the apartment, to the slow, silent swell of her body. It was then the wind returned, or perhaps it had never left. Now it carried new sounds. At night, lying beside Austin's sleeping form, Gracie would hear it. A low, rhythmic humming that seemed to vibrate through the wall she shared with the Vances. It was not a tune, but a tone, a single, sustained note that felt both ancient and deeply wrong. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and settled in the teeth, in the marrow of the bones. When she mentioned it to Austin, he smiled indulgently. "Old pipes, Gracie, or the subway. You're not sleeping well." He would place a hand on her belly, his touch proprietary, proud. "We're making a future here." The omens accumulated like dust in the corners. Gracie began to notice the patterns in the building. Mrs. Gable in 2A took her small yapping dog for a walk at exactly 3:17 p.m. every day. Mr. Hemlock in 4C would stand at his window from midnight until 1, a motionless silhouette against the drawn shade. The Vance's movements were the most precise of all. Every Tuesday and Friday evening, just after sunset, they would leave their apartment, always dressed in somber, formal clothing, and descend the stairs, never the elevator, their footsteps falling in imperfect, unhurried unison. Gracie, peering through the peephole, once saw Eleanor pause and turn her head, those unblinking blue eyes seeming to look directly back at her through the tiny lens. She started dreaming of the building, not as it was, but as something alive and breathing. In these dreams, the hallway was a throat, the apartments were lungs, and the wind that whispered through it was the building's voice. It was calling for something. It was calling for her child. Her photographs became a secret project. She began documenting the building's details, not as a new homeowner would, but as an archaeologist of dread. The strange, vein-like patterns in the water stains on the ceiling, the way the shadows in the long hallway congealed at a certain hour, forming a shape that was almost a door. The faces of her neighbors, captured in fleeting moments from her window, their expressions uniformly blank, as if their personalities had been scoured away, leaving only a patient, waiting stillness. One afternoon, she developed a photo she had taken of the building's facade. In the developed print, every window was a dark, vacant eye except for one, their own. And in their window, a pale, blurred face looked out. It was not her face, and it was not Austin's. It was a child's face, but its eyes were old, and its mouth was open in a silent, hungry O. She showed it to Austin that night. He held the photograph under the lamplight, his brow furrowed. For a moment she saw a flicker of something in his face. Not fear, but recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by a smooth, practiced concern. "It's a double exposure, honey, or a trick of the light. You're stressed. The pregnancy, it's making you see things." He took her hands. His were cold. "The Vances were asking about you today. They're worried. They say you've been agitated." They're watching me, Austin. They're our neighbors. They're kind people. What do you talk about with Arthur when you come home so late? His smile was thin. Business, Gracie. Just business. For us. For our family. The humming grew louder, more insistent. It began to synchronize with the baby's movements, a frantic kicking in time with the dissonant rhythm from the other side of the wall. Gracie felt the child was not just listening, but responding. She stopped sleeping. She stopped eating. The world narrowed to the prison of the apartment, the constant, whispering wind, and the thing growing inside her that was beginning to feel less like a baby and more like a vessel being filled with a terrible, ancient presence. The revelation came on a Tuesday, the night of the Vance's ritual departure. Austin was working late again. The wind was silent for the first time in weeks, the stillness somehow more menacing than the noise. Driven by a compulsion she no longer had the strength to fight, Gracie went to the door. She did not look through the peephole. Instead, she opened it. The hallway was empty, lit by a single flickering bulb at its far end. The door to 3B was ajar, just a crack. A sliver of amber light spilled out onto the worn runner. And from within, she heard it. Not the humming, but a voice. Eleanor Vance's voice, soft and crooning, singing a lullaby. Hush now, darling, don't you cry. The wind will sing our lullaby. The waiting world is cold and gray, but you will bring the brand new day. Listen. Gracie moved as if in a trance, her bare feet making no sound on the floor. She pressed her eye to the crack in the door. The apartment was not laid out like theirs. The walls had been knocked down to create a single, vast room. It was filled with people, all her neighbors, standing in a silent circle. They were all there. Mrs. Gable, Mr. Hemlock, the quiet couple from the first floor. They wore dark robes. In the center of the room, Arthur Vance stood before the hearth, which was not a hearth, but a deep, black opening in the wall, a void from which the whispering wind seemed to originate. Austin stood beside him, her husband. His face was serene, bathed in the strange non-light that emanated from the void. He was not a prisoner. He was a participant. Arthur's voice was a low rumble. The vessel is prepared. The covenant is nearly fulfilled. The silence has been long, but the voice will soon return to the wind. Austin nodded, his eyes gleaming with an avarice that was entirely human, and for that, infinitely more horrifying than any monster. And my part of the agreement? The partnership? The advancements? All will be yours, Arthur said, his gaze shifting for a terrifying second to the crack in the door where Gracie stood frozen. As promised, the architect of the new world needs a firm foundation. Eleanor, standing near the circle, turned her head slowly and smiled directly at Gracie. Her pale blue eyes held no surprise, only a deep, bottomless welcome. She's ready, Eleanor said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a clear, carrying bell. The mother is here. The circle of neighbors turned in unison. Their faces were not monstrous. They were placid, expectant. They looked at her not with malice, but with the gratitude of the parched who see a rain cloud on the horizon. Gracie stumbled back, her body a frantic broken machine of fear. She fled down the hallway, through her own door, locking it behind her. She huddled in the corner of the bedroom, her arms wrapped around her massive belly, which was now tight and hard with a pain that was not entirely physical. The baby was still, too still. The wind began again, louder than ever before, no longer a whisper, but a chorus. 1,000 voices speaking a single, incomprehensible word that was also a name. When Austin found her hours later, she was catatonic, her eyes fixed on the wall she shared with the Vances. He did not call a doctor. He simply carried her to bed, his touch gentle, his expression one of sorrow and resolve. It's for the best, Gracie. he whispered, his lips close to her ear. "You'll see. Our child will be remarkable." The birth was a silent, bloody affair in their own bed, attended by Eleanor Vance, whose hands were impossibly strong and sure. Gracie, trapped in the prison of her own mind, felt it all as if from a great distance. The tearing pain, the final, wrenching push, and then the silence. A profound, absolute silence that swallowed the world. Eleanor held up the child. It was a boy. He did not cry. He opened his eyes, and they were the pale, liquid blue of Eleanor Vance's. He looked at Gracie, and in that look was an intelligence that was millennia old. Austin took the child, his face transfigured with a love that was indistinguishable from triumph. "My son," he breathed. From the living room, the wind began to blow again, but it was different now. It was no longer a question. It was a command. It was a song of praise. Gracie was moved to a clean, white room in a quiet facility overlooking a calm sea. Austin was very generous, the doctor said. He visited once a month, always alone, his suits growing more expensive, his demeanor more powerful. He never spoke of the apartment on Alder Street. He would sit beside her and talk of his work, of the new globe-spanning projects his firm was undertaking, of the world that was slowly, surely, being reshaped according to a brilliant new design. On his last visit, he did something different. He placed a small portable radio on her bedside table. "I thought you might like some music," he said. He turned it on. It was not music. It was the sound of the wind, the same wind that had whispered through their old apartment. But now, it was stronger, clearer, a constant roaring presence on the airwaves. And if you listened very, very closely beneath the roar, you could hear it. Not a whisper, but a voice. A young, clear, impossibly ancient voice, speaking a single word over and over again. A word that was slowly becoming the most important word in the world. A word that was a name. Her son's name. Gracie sat in her chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the distant, placid horizon. She never moved. She never spoke. But inside, in the deep, silent places where her mind had retreated, she was screaming. She was screaming and screaming, and the only thing that answered was the wind, and the voice of her child, singing back to her. He never told her the name. It was the final, perfect cruelty. The voice on the radio was a familiar stranger, a lullaby sung in a tongue she had never learned but understood in her bones. The doctors noted a slight increase in her heart rate during his visits, a tiny spike on their charts that they attributed to the stress of seeing her successful, estranged husband. They never thought to question the radio. It was always on. A low, constant, static hiss from which meaning occasionally coalesced, a word surfacing like a shark from dark water. Her days were a flat, gray expanse. Orderlies brought food. Nurses checked her vitals. The view from the window never changed, but the world outside was changing. She could feel it in the quality of the silence in the hallways, in the way the staff sometimes paused, their heads cocked as if listening to a distant frequency. Newspapers were not allowed, but she saw glimpses on the televisions mounted high in the common rooms. The sound was always off, but the images were clear. There were rallies in city squares, vast, orderly crowds whose mouths moved in unison. There were new, strangely beautiful buildings going up, structures that defied physics and seemed to drink a light. The newscasters' faces were serene, their eyes possessing a placid blue stillness she recognized. Austin's empire was being built, stone by stone, and its foundation was the thing that had been born in her bed on Alder Street. One afternoon, a new orderly was assigned to her wing. He was young, with kind, nervous eyes. As he was straightening her room, his hand brushed against the radio, and the knob turned, the volume spiking for a single shocking moment. The voice filled the room, no longer a whisper but a clear, declarative statement. It was speaking about unity, about the great silence that had preceded the New Age, about the need for a single guiding will. The orderly fumbled with the radio, his face pale. "Sorry, man. Nasty stuff, that station. Don't know why anyone listens." He managed to turn the dial, and the voice was replaced by the bland strains of an orchestral piece. Gracie's eyes, for the first time in years, moved from the window. She looked at the young man. She did not speak, but her gaze was a question. He saw it. He hesitated, then leaned in slightly, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "They say it's just a cult, but it's getting bigger. My brother, he joined. He doesn't talk to us anymore. He just listens." He shook his head, a genuine fear in his eyes. "They call him the architect, the one behind it all. Just a kid, they say, but he speaks. And people change." He left quickly, as if he had said too much. Gracie turned back to the window. The architect. So that was what they called her. Son. The word settled inside her, not as a name, but as a function. A purpose. Austin had not just traded his family for power. He had become the chief engineer for a new god. That night, the wind outside her window, the real sea wind, began to sound different. It was no longer a random natural force. It was trying to form words. It was an echo of the voice on the radio, a faint, desperate mimicry. The world itself was becoming a receiver. During Austin's next visit, she finally broke. It was not a dramatic shattering. It was a quiet, internal snap, like a single thread holding up a great weight finally giving way. He was talking about a new project, a transcontinental railway that would run on principles he couldn't possibly understand, when her hand twitched in her lap. He stopped mid-sentence, watching her. "Gracie?" Her lips, dry and cracked, parted. A sound, rusted from disuse, scraped its way out of her throat. It was not a word. It was a note. The same low, rhythmic hum that had once vibrated through the wall from the Vance's apartment. Austin's face went slack with shock. Then a slow, dawning smile spread across his features. It was not a smile of joy, but of vindication. "You hear it, don't you?" he whispered, leaning closer. "You finally hear the song. I knew you would. It was in you all along. You were the conduit, the vessel. You just fought it." She hummed again, the tone perfectly matching the memory, resonating with the hidden frequency of the world. She saw the effect it had on him. His eyes lost their sharp, businesslike focus and grew hazy, receptive. He was still him, but he was listening now, not to her but to the meaning behind the sound. She was using their own weapon. She was humming the lullaby of the wind. She pushed, forcing more air, giving the hum a subtle, questioning lift at the end. A call. And from the small, sleek radio on the table, an answer came. Not the voice, but the wind itself. Swelling in volume for a 3-second burst, a gust had rattled the window pane. Austin's breath caught. He looked from her to the radio and back again, his expression one of religious awe. "He hears you," Austin breathed. After all this time, he hears his mother. He stood up abruptly, his movements jerky with excitement. "I have to go. I have to tell them. This changes everything." He rushed from the room, not looking back. Gracie let the hum die in her throat. She was cold, colder than she had ever been. She had not reached her son. She had not broken the spell. She had simply proven to them that the connection was still live, that the vessel, though cracked, could still transmit. She had made herself interesting again. She looked at the radio. The voice had returned, calm and measured. It was talking about the beauty of obedience, the peace found in surrender. But beneath the words, in the spaces between the syllables, Gracie heard something new. Not a command, and not a lullaby. It was a question directed at her alone. A single, simple, and terrifying question. It was the same question the wind had asked in the empty apartment on the first day. And now, after all that had happened, she finally knew the answer. The answer was no. It was a small, hard thing, a seed of defiance buried so deep the tendrils of the wind had never been able to find it. It was the part of her that had taken the photographs, that had opened the door, that had hidden in the silent places of her mind. It was the part of her that was still a mother, not a vessel. The orderly returned the next day, his hands shaking as he set down her lunch tray. He would not meet her eyes. "They're transferring me," he mumbled. "Effective immediately." Gracie did not hum. She did not move. But as he turned to leave, she let her gaze fall to the radio, then back to him. A deliberate, meaningful shift. He paused, his shoulders tense. "They asked me what I heard in here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I told them it was just the orchestra, but they knew I was lying. They always know." He fled, and she knew she would not see him again. Her one fragile link to the world of dissent was severed. That evening the radio fell silent. The hiss of static ceased, leaving a vacuum of sound that was more oppressive than the voice had ever been. It was a punishment. It was a test. They were waiting to see if she would call out again, if she would try to summon the song without their permission. She sat in the perfect quiet, the only sound the frantic beating of her own heart. She held the no inside her, a shield against the silence. Austin did not come the next month, nor a month after that. The world outside the window continued its strange metamorphosis. The sea was often preternaturally calm, its surface like oiled glass. The birds no longer flew near her window. The doctors and nurses moved with a new, synchronized efficiency, their individual quirks sanded away. They were all listening to the same station now, even without a radio. Then, one rain-streaked afternoon, a woman walked into her room. She was not a doctor or a nurse. She was dressed in a severe gray suit, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes were the same pale, knowing blue as Eleanor Vance's. "Hello, Grace," the woman said. Her voice was pleasant, but it carried an undertone of immense, unassailable authority. "I am Dr. Albright. I've been assigned to your case." Gracie remained still, her eyes on the horizon. "We are so pleased with your progress," Dr. Albright continued, moving to stand by the window. The initial vocalization was a promising sign. A reconnection. The architect was most gratified. At the mention of her son, Gracie felt a physical pain, a wrenching in her chest. She did not let it show. "Your silence now is understood," Dr. Albright said, turning to face her. "It is a mother's grief, and it is respected. But the time for grief is passing. The new world requires its first mother to be whole, to be present." She walked to the bedside table and picked up the silent radio. "This is a relic. The voice no longer needs such crude amplification. It is in the air now. It is in the water. It is in the minds of those who are ready to listen." She set the radio back down. "Your son wishes to see you." This was the moment. This was the precipice. Gracie kept her face a mask of placid emptiness, but inside, the no screamed. "He is at the heart of the new city," Dr. Albright said, a devotional gleam in her eye. "He has built a place for you. A quiet garden where the wind speaks only of peace. He wants to thank you. He wants to show you what your sacrifice has wrought." Gracie knew it was not an invitation. It was a summons. To see him would be to look into the eyes of the thing that had consumed her child, to stand in the presence of the power Austin had worshipped. It would be the final surrender. Dr. Albright waited, her head tilted. The room was utterly silent. But Gracie could feel a pressure building in the air, a listening presence that was far vaster than the woman standing before her. It was waiting for her answer. Slowly, deliberately, Gracie turned her head from the window. She looked directly at Dr. Albright. She did not speak. She did not hum. She simply let the woman look into her eyes, and she hoped that somewhere, in the depths of that placid blue, the no she had nurtured for so long would be seen for what it was. Not a mother's grief, but a mother's war. Dr. Albright's pleasant smile did not falter, but it became fixed, a porcelain mask over something calculating and cold. She had seen the refusal. She had understood it perfectly. "I see," she said, her voice still smooth, but now with an edge like a surgical blade. "The journey to wholeness is often fraught with setbacks. We will continue your treatment here then. A new regimen." She left, and the silence in the room deepened, becoming a tangible weight. That night, the wind outside did not return. Instead, a new sound began. So low it was felt more than heard. A vibration that started in the bones and worked its way inward. It was the hum. The same hum Gracie had used, but now it was being piped into her room, a constant droning frequency meant to break her will, to soothe her into submission. It was a lullaby for a prisoner. She fought it. She focused on the memory of Austin's face before the void in the hearth, the naked greed in his eyes. She focused on the feel of her own body tearing apart. She held on to the no until her jaw ached from clenching. Days bled into nights under the relentless hum. Her food began to taste different, metallic and thin, and she knew they were drugging her. The world outside her window grew more distorted. One morning, she saw a freighter on the horizon, its silhouette wrong, its prow curling upward like a petal seeking the sun. It was being remade, even as it sailed. During one of the drugged hazes, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. It was from the day she had developed the photographs. The last picture, the one of the empty crib. But in her mind's eye, she saw something else now. Something she had missed. Tucked into the corner of the crib's bumper, almost invisible, was a small, folded piece of paper. A corner was torn, as if it had been ripped from a larger sheet. It was nothing. It was everything. A flaw in their design. A secret the silent, watching apartment had kept. The next time a nurse came to check her vitals, Gracie let her eyelids droop, let her body go limp in the chair. She allowed a tiny, soft hum to escape her lips, matching the frequency of the room almost perfectly. But she let it waver at the end, let it sound weak and pliant. The nurse paused, her fingers on Gracie's wrist. She did not look surprised. She simply nodded to herself and made a note on her chart. The hum in the room ceased. The drugs in her food lessened. They thought she was yielding. They were giving her space to fully capitulate. She used the clarity to plan. She was weak, her muscles atrophied, but the core of her was strong, hardened by years of silent resistance. She watched the patterns of the staff. She noted the single camera-like device in the corner of her room, its unblinking red eye. She waited for her moment. It came during a storm. Not a storm of wind, but of something else. A sudden, violent atmospheric pressure change that made the lights flicker, and the staff hurried and distracted. The camera's red eye blinked out for a full 3 minutes. It was now or never. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she pushed herself out of the chair. She shuffled to the door. It was, as always, locked. But the frame was old, the wood around the lock slightly splintered from years of use. She braced herself, then threw her shoulder against the door, not near the lock, but a few inches above it. The jolt of pain was electric, but she heard a faint groan of stressed wood. She did it again, and again. On the 5th try, with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet hallway, the wood around the lock gave way, and the door swung open. The hallway was empty, the nurse's station deserted. The air crackled with wrongness. She moved, a ghost in a white gown, past other closed doors. She did not know where she was going. only that she had to get out, to find a crack in this new world, a place where the hum did not reach. She found a service staircase and stumbled down, flight after flight, until she pushed open a heavy door and emerged not onto the street, but into a vast, empty kitchen. It was late. The ovens were cold. At the far end was a delivery entrance, a rolling metal door shut tight. Next to it was a small, ordinary door with a push-bar handle. She ran for it, her bare feet slapping on the cold tile. She shoved the bar. An alarm should have sounded. Nothing did. The door opened onto an alley, and the world she had only seen through her window finally swallowed her whole. The air was thick and still, humming with the same pervasive frequency that had been piped into her room. The city around her was a monstrous parody. Buildings curved and spiraled into the bruised purple sky, their surfaces shimmering as if wet. There were no cars. People moved in quiet, purposeful streams, their faces blank, their steps synchronized. They did not look at her. They did not see the escaped patient in a hospital gown. They were all listening. And above it all, woven into the fabric of the air itself, was the voice. It was her son's voice, a beautiful, chilling sound that spoke of order and peace, and the glorious silence of a single will. It was everywhere. Gracie stood shivering in the alley, the nose screaming inside her, a tiny, insignificant thing against the roaring symphony of the new world. She had escaped her room, but the prison was infinitely larger than she had ever imagined. There was nowhere to run. There was only perhaps a crib in a forgotten apartment, and a tiny, folded piece of paper waiting in the dark. The rain began to fall, but it did not feel like rain. Each drop was a tiny, cold impact, too uniform, as if the sky itself was weeping on command. She had to get off the street. The orderly streams of people were beginning to falter, their synchronized steps breaking as their heads, in unison, began to turn toward the alley. A ripple of disruption was moving through them. She had been seen, not by their eyes, but by the thing that guided them. She stumbled farther into the alley, her bare feet slipping on the strange, slick pavement. A dumpster, its shape unnaturally rounded, offered a moment of cover. She pressed herself against its cold metal, trying to quiet her breathing. The voice in the air shifted. It was no longer speaking of unity. It was issuing a gentle, parental correction, a call for a lost lamb to return to the fold. A door opened halfway down the alley, spilling a trapezoid of yellow light onto the wet ground. A man in kitchen white stood there, holding a bag of trash. He was older, with a tired, sagging face that had not yet been completely smoothed into placidity. He saw her. His eyes widened, not with alarm, but with a deep, weary recognition. He did not speak. He jerked his head toward the open door, then tossed the bag into a different dumpster. It was a fleeting gesture, over in a second. He turned and went back inside, leaving the door ajar. It was a trap. It had to be. But the footsteps at the mouth of the alley were getting closer. A soft, shuffling sound of a dozen people, moving as one. Gracie pushed herself away from the dumpster and ran for the light. She slipped through the door into a humid, steamy room that smelled of old grease and disinfectant. The cook was standing by a giant stainless steel stove, his back to her. "Lock it," he said, his voice a low grumble. She fumbled with the bolt, her fingers clumsy and cold. The sound of the lock sliding home was the loudest thing she had heard in years. "They'll be at the front in a minute," he said, still not turning around. He was scrubbing a pot with a fierce, concentrated energy. "They'll ask if I've seen you. I'll say no. They might not believe me. They usually know." He finally glanced over his shoulder, his eyes taking in her gown, her bare feet, her wild eyes. "You're her. The mother." Gracie could only stare, her chest heaving. "Alder Street," he said. And it was not a question. He nodded to himself. "My sister lived next door, the Vances. She joined them early. I haven't heard her real voice in 5 years." He put the pot down with a clang. "You can't stay here. They'll sweep the whole block." "Where?" The word was a croak, torn from her throat. The cook looked at her, a flicker of the old world in his eyes. "There is no where anymore. Not that they don't control." He wiped his hands on a rag. "But there are cracks. Places the voice is thin. The old places. They hate the old places." He moved to a large walk-in pantry and pulled the door open. Inside, behind sacks of flour and rice, was a small, rusty grate covering an air duct. He wrestled it off. "Go. It's tight, but it leads down to the old service tunnels. From there, you'll have to feel your way. Listen for the silence. It's the only map you have." Yeah." The sound of a polite, firm knock came from the front of the kitchen. The cook's face tightened. "Go. Now." Gracie didn't hesitate. She crawled into the dark, cold opening, pulling her gown after her. The cook slid the grate back into place just as she heard the front door open and Dr. Albright's calm, reasonable voice echo through the kitchen. The duct was a tight, metal coffin. She could only go down, sliding on her belly into a deeper, colder dark. The hum of the voice faded, replaced by the sound of dripping water and the scuttling of unseen things. She was in the bones of the city, the world that had been buried to make way for the new. And for the first time since she had stepped outside, the pressure in her head began to ease. Here, the air was still. Here, the only thing listening was the dark. She crawled for what felt like miles, the metal tearing at her skin and gown. The descent was steep. Then it leveled out into a larger tunnel, this one made of damp brick that smelled of earth and decay. A single, flickering fluorescent tube lit a section of the passage, casting long, dancing shadows. The silence was a physical relief, a balm on her raw nerves. This was an old place, a forgotten artery. She followed the tunnel, her hand trailing along the cold, wet brick. She walked for a long time, the only sound the drip of water and the ragged pull of her own breath. Then she heard it, a sound so faint she thought it was her imagination. A scratch, then a whisper. She froze, pressing herself against the wall. The whisper came again, clearer now. It was a human voice, but it was broken, a dry rustle of sound. "Can you hear it?" It was not the voice. It was something else, something desperate. She peered around a curve in the tunnel. A small group of people were huddled under a dead light, wrapped in ragged coats and blankets. They were gathered around a small battery-powered radio, but it was not playing the orchestra. It was scanning through a storm of static, and a man was slowly, painstakingly turning the dial, his ear pressed to the speaker. "Anything?" a woman asked, her voice thin with hope. "Nothing but the hum?" The man sighed, leaning back. His face was gaunt, etched with a profound weariness. "It's getting harder. The quiet places are shrinking." One of them, a younger woman with fierce eyes, noticed Gracie first. She stood up quickly, a makeshift knife appearing in her hand. "Who are you?" Gracie had no answer that would make sense. She just stood there, shivering in her hospital gown. The man with the radio looked at her, his eyes widening as they took in her appearance. He lowered the radio. "You came from the surface," he breathed. "From the Institute." The woman with the knife did not lower it. "They sent her. A tracker." "No," the man said, shaking his head. He took a step closer. "Look at her. She's running." He looked at Gracie, his gaze intense. "You're the source, aren't you? The mother." The small group stirred, a mix of awe and fear passing between them. "We heard the stories," the man continued. "That you spoke back, that you broke the silence for a moment. Is it true?" Gracie found her voice, a fragile, unused thing. "I said no." A profound silence fell over the group. Then the man smiled. It was a cracked, broken thing, but it was real. "Then you are the first," he said. the first to refuse him to his face. He gestured for her to join them. "My name is Eli. These are the echoes. We live in the places the voice cannot reach. We listen for other stations, for other voices, for a world that might still be outside." The woman with the knife finally lowered it. "They'll be hunting you," she said, her tone now one of grim practicality. "They'll tear these tunnels apart." Eli nodded. "We have to move. But first..." He held out the radio to Gracie. "You hunt for them. Can you do something else?" "Not for him. For us." Gracie looked at the small, cheap radio. It was a pathetic thing, a toy against the power that saturated the world above. But it was a transmitter, and she was a vessel, cracked and flawed. She thought of the folded paper in the crib, the tiny physical proof of a world before the wind. She thought of her son, lost in the beautiful, terrible song. She took the radio. She did not hum. She closed her eyes and reached for the small, hard no inside her. She focused on it, polished it, gave it all the love and grief and rage of a mother. And then she opened her mouth and let it out. Not as a word, but as a pure, silent frequency of defiance. The radio in her hands did not transmit it, but somewhere, deep in the infrastructure of the new city, a relay station flickered. A single, impossible blip of dead air appeared on 1,000 synchronized screens. It lasted for less than a second. It was a glitch, a nothing. But in the silent dark of the tunnels, Eli's radio suddenly crackled to life. For a single, crystalline moment, the static cleared, and a clear, strong voice from a distant, untouched place said, "Repeat, this is the USS Liberty. Does anyone copy? We are monitoring anomalous energy." Then the hum rushed back in, drowning it. The silence that followed was electric. They had all heard it. Eli looked at Gracie, his eyes shining with a light she had not seen in years. It was the light of a signal, received across a vast and hopeless dark. "They're out there," he whispered. Gracie handed the radio back. Her work was not done. It had only just begun. She had a piece of paper to find. "Thank you for making it all the way to the end and for joining me on another journey through our nighttime scary stories. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next tales. And to help our channel grow, wishing you a calm, peaceful good night. And I'll see you tomorrow with a brand new story.